The police started looking for a girl who had spent the night at her friend's house before she vanished without a trace the next morning. Her bedroom window was wide open and all of her belongings were still there. No one suspected the dark secrets that would soon come to light in the small town. Welcome to A to Z Crime Stories. Before we start, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more. Amanda Lenka was born on June 7, 1991 in Tennessee. She grew up in a big, loving family with many brothers and sisters before moving with their parents to Spring Hill, Florida. She loved spending time there because she had many friends there. White Cloud was a quiet, peaceful town with a population of only 400 people. Most of its residents knew each other. Children played without adult supervision, and no one worried about their safety. Amanda was passionate about dancing, writing poetry, playing multiple musical instruments, and being a very positive child. During school breaks, she always went to her grandparents' house in that town. On June 20th, Amanda spent the night at the home of her best friend. They chatted, had fun, and went to bed late. The next morning, her friend woke up and discovered Amanda was not in the room. The bedroom windows were wide open. She went to the kitchen and looked all over the house, but Amanda was nowhere to be found. Amanda had just completed the 7th grade of middle school. She spent the entire summer in White Cloud with her friends, went for walks, and enjoyed her vacation. Belongings, such as clothes and a backpack, were left in the bedroom. When the friend reported Amanda missing to her parents, they called her grandparents, walked several blocks, and called the parents of Amanda's other friends, but no one had seen her. Then the relatives decided to contact the police because they realized that Amanda could not have left without notice, especially in just her pajamas. First, investigators spoke with the friend of Amanda, who claimed that she did not see Amanda L. The girl's friend's parents, as well as her brother and sister, were in the house at the time of the disappearance, but none of them heard or saw anything. Police also tried to find witnesses who lived nearby that night, but they came up empty-handed. On the first day of the investigation, the investigators came to the conclusion that the girl had likely left home on her own initiative and run away. This version outraged Amanda's relatives, who insisted that the girl had no problems at home and was happy to spend the entire summer in White Cloud. In addition, they pointed out that the girl left all her things, including clothes, in her friend's room, and that 5 people did not hear anything. It was difficult to imagine a scenario in which Amanda could have been abducted without waking up her friend who was sleeping just a meter away. When word of Amanda's disappearance spread throughout the neighborhood, the police received numerous calls from witnesses who claimed to have seen a similar girl in various locations, which only increased the detectives' certainty that Amanda had fled her home. Unable to confirm any of these leads, the investigators decided to check the girl's computer in the hopes of finding some information that could aid in the search. They discovered pertinent information. Although there were inconsistencies, these correspondences made no mention of a potential meeting and were about routine, everyday matters. The investigators still believed they had enough evidence to confirm their suspicions at the time. However, word of Amanda's correspondence with a particular man quickly spread among the city's residents, leading many to believe that she had run away to meet him. Because of this misunderstanding, the investigators did not really use the full scope of their resources. If they had officially classified this case as a kidnapping, they could have enlisted the FBI and other agencies in the investigation. Instead, they chose to focus on the case themselves. Meanwhile, Amanda's family was posting flyers and giving interviews to various media outlets, insisting that Amanda could not have fled on her own initiative. On July 5th, mushroom pickers went to a forest about 10 kilometers from White Cloud, where they discovered a human body and reported it to the police. Investigators arrived at the scene and immediately recognized the body as Amanda because she was lanky and wearing the same pajamas she had disappeared in. Despite their half-hearted search for her, they never found any serious leads on her possible location, and the investigation dragged on for several weeks. Confirmed her identity and discovered that Amanda had died the night of her disappearance after suffering multiple blows from a heavy object. Investigators came to the conclusion that the victim had been killed elsewhere before being brought to the forest, but they were unable to find any significant leads, so they decided to speak to everyone who knew the girl. Over the course of the following few days, police interviewed about 400 people, or nearly 1/3 of the population of White Cloud. However, since the young man with whom Amanda had communicated online had the word killer in his nickname, they decided to take another look at him. While this did not produce any answers, the police also decided to consider the possibility that the victim actually went to meet him and was killed there. However, this theory still had many flaws. For instance, there was no evidence to support the idea that the girl would have gone to meet someone in the middle of the night while wearing pajamas, and there was also no evidence that in an effort to find some new leads, detectives decided to examine all of Amanda's possessions, which resulted in a breakthrough. They discovered her personal diary, which contained very disturbing information. Shortly before her death, Amanda wrote that a certain man had been harassing her, and the next several pages were torn out. The investigator could not identify this person, and soon the version of his involvement was no longer taken into consideration. Leaving the case, police attempted to identify the man's identity. They spoke to all of Amanda's friends and asked if the girl had brought up anything regarding this. Several of her friends acknowledged that she had indeed told them about it, and even named the man Cecil Wallace. He was the stepfather of Amanda's friend with whom she had spent the night for detectives. This information was a real surprise. They had been searching for the killer throughout the town and beyond, and in the end, But the testimony of the friends was not enough to arrest him. Investigators had no substantial evidence against the man. No DNA samples were found on the victim's body, and the court documents did not indicate whether she had been subjected to violence. Detectives questioned Wallace, but he denied any involvement in the crimes. The police themselves wondered how the man could have done all this unnoticed in a small house where his wife and 3 children slept. Without serious evidence or confession, they could not detain Wallace. Therefore, the detectives continued to work on all possible leads. Soon after, an interesting fact emerged. It turned out that Wallace's sister Candace worked in the police department that was handling Amanda's case. Moreover, the woman actively helped her brother and his family during the interrogations. She literally told him what to say and how to behave. But that was not all. 5 years ago, she was fired from another police department for falsifying a report on her brother's accident. She wrote that he was driving on a road. Wallace claimed that a deer ran out in front of him as he was driving, but in reality, the man was drunk and had an accident. At that point, other detectives were already working on Amanda's case, and they questioned the impartiality of the local police's investigation, but they were unable to confirm that anyone else could be assisting Wallace. The investigators spoke with Wallace and his family several more times, but this did not produce any results. They continued to search for any leads, but instead of finding any 4 years after the murder in 2008, detectives turned to the National Center for Missing and Explosion after receiving repeated complaints from the Wallace family that their home had been vandalized. The town's unanimity that the man was a murderer and that his sister was covering it up only increased in negative sentiments. Wallace continued to live among them freely, which only heightened these feelings. 3 more years passed before the police finally got a new lead that changed everything. In 2011, a 27-year-old Texas woman who grew up in White Cloud went to a news website from her old town where she found information about Amanda's murder and swore it was her. She then contacted the police. They had gone through all the case materials, conducted new interrogations, and tried to find new leads. Ultimately, they came to the same conclusion as the local detectives, that there was not enough evidence to make an in 1998, when the victim was 13 years old and still a resident of that city. She spent the night at the Wallace home because she was friends with his second foster daughter. In the middle of the night, a man broke into their room and assaulted both of them before threatening to keep quiet. The victims were too terrified to call the police, so they never reported what had happened. In Amanda's case, she made the decision to contact the police, and then she provided them with a statement that assisted investigators in moving closer to the arrest of the suspect. They spoke with many people in White Cloud who might have been impacted by Wallace's actions, and this tactic was successful because they were able to identify several women who admitted that the man had touched them inappropriately. This incident occurred between 1998 and 2002. The victims were then between the ages of 13 and 16. Putting all this information together, police detained Wallace, 43, in October 2011. Wallace was charged with sexually assaulting these victims and was also the first person to be officially named as a suspect in Amanda's case. Detectives had no doubt that Wallace was responsible for the murder, and at the preliminary hearing, he was given bail of $150,000. and other family members assisted him in raising the funds. The trial was scheduled to start in a month. While waiting for this, Wallace returned to work. The locals were not happy that he had been released on bail. They frequently protested outside the company's office, demanding that this man be fired. On November 10th, on the day of the first court hearing, an unexpected turn occurred. Wallace did not show up at the appointed time, and the police immediately declared him wanted. A few days later, Wallace was found in a local jail. Detectives who did not anticipate this turn of events were forced to continue the inquiry after the suspect passed away. They could only rely on strong evidence that could connect him to Amanda's death. They obtained a search warrant for his home in an effort to find any evidence connected to Amanda's murder. They looked around every corner, tore down some walls and lifted floorboards, but they found nothing. After gathering the necessary evidence, detectives turned their attention to the suspect's sister, Candace, believing that she was protecting her brother and wanting to know if she was aware that he had killed Amanda. Candace was detained in August 2012. She was accused of deliberately misleading the investigation, but that was just the beginning. Throughout the course of the investigation, detectives discovered that Candace had been concealing her brother's drug dealing during those times. Candace also advised him to always carry a cigarette with someone else's DNA on it, so that if necessary he could plant it at the crime scene. Detectives also concluded that at least 9 people knew about Wallace's crimes, but remained silent. All of them were members of his family. The police were also of the opinion that at least 9 people knew about Wallace's crimes, but remained silent. Wallace's sister could not provide consulting services on a case that she was working on as a police officer, given that she had been assisting her brother through interrogations. She broke this rule and was ultimately punished, but Candace insisted that her brothel was involved for another 2 years before making a deal with the police in which she admitted to lying to the investigators in exchange for the dismissal of 2 other charges. If a person has committed a minor offense, they can be given several weekends in jail. This way they receive a punishment, but it does not significantly affect their life. The convicted person can continue to go to work and spend time with their family, of course. This is a dubious practice where the convict is only required to be in the jail building for 2 days a week and can freely roam during the rest of the time. In 2004, medical experts only handed over part of Amanda's remains to her family so they could hold a funeral. The remainder was to be kept by detectives during the investigation, but after Wallace's death, a decision was made to hand over the remainder to the family. The detectives were sure that Candace had helped her brother avoid punishment, and because approving it 100% was not possible, she received such a light punishment. Amanda's family was forced to undergo yet another trial. She also works to change the law to change how the police search for missing children. The mother insists that investigators should not conduct an investigation based on their subjective assessments and consider the disappearance as a voluntary escape from home. Thus, there is almost no doubt that Wallace committed the disappearance. However, there is still some doubt that Wallace committed the disappearance. Given that there is no information in the court records regarding whether the victim was subjected to violence, 2 assumptions can be made. He likely assaulted her but did not leave his biological material, so the investigation decided not to disclose this fact because it was unnecessary. Detectives could also withhold this information for the sake of the investigation in the hopes that the criminal would reveal facts that had never been revealed. His prior crimes also speak in FA. The detective suggested that all of Wallace's relatives who were in the house on the night of the murder were aware of the crime and may have even assisted in it. Wallace had at least 3 victims using the same scheme, and all of them stayed at his house overnight. The question is why he killed Amanda. Perhaps he intended to intimidate her like the others, but the girl threatened to tell the truth to everyone or she tried to flee from him and he panicked. The fact that Wallace settled the score with his life before the trial speaks in favor of his guilt, even though he took the specifics of this crime to the grave, as his wife, son, and daughter were present, which may have explained how he was able to attack the victim without waking any of his family. In any case, even without a final ruling from the court, Wallace will no longer be able to harm anyone. Share your opinion in the comments, and don't forget to like this video if you liked it. Thanks for watching. What happened to Sheila Josephine Harris, and why this case angered the public? Sheila Josephine Harris was a young woman who won a beauty contest and was discovered dead in her own apartment. The police started looking for the murderer without realizing the repercussions it would have. Sheila Josephine Harris was born on February 26, 1963, in Douglas County, Nevada. She knew she wanted to be an actress or a model from a young age. Therefore, she actively competed in numerous beauty contests during her school years. Sheila won a local beauty contest in her district in her senior year of high school and planned to compete for Miss Nevada and Miss Carson City in case of victory. Despite such ambitious plans, the young woman decided to pursue a higher education in the field of business and trade after graduating. They later remarried and had 2 more daughters, and Sheila actively assisted her mother in caring for her younger sisters. They tried to see each other as often as possible, but due to her studies and work, they were only able to spend time together a few times a week. On January 4, 1939, the young woman rented an apartment and took a part-time job at a supermarket to cover her living expenses. The young woman took her studies and work very seriously because she wanted to have a good education and provide for herself independently. Sheila was scheduled to start her morning shift at the supermarket the following day, so she wanted to go to bed early despite his injury. Stephen decided to see her off, and they parted at the entrance to the residential complex the following day. Sheila did not show up for work. The store manager noticed her absence and was greatly alarmed. Stephen had recently broken his arm, and the young woman occasionally visited him. He once called Sheila's home phone, but there was no answer, so we got in touch with her mother to find out if anything had happened. At first, Sheila's mother assumed that Sheila had simply overslept, but when the building manager said he had called Sheila's home phone, the woman became alarmed. She decided to visit Sheila's apartment, but she asked a friend to go with her because she was too worried and afraid to go alone. The mother arrived at. She entered the apartment and was greeted by a horrifying scene that caused her to scream. Sheila lay in bed without any signs of life. Blood was all around her, and bruises could be seen all over her neck. Although a friend had tried to prevent the mother from seeing this heartbreaking scene, the woman still went inside and saw her dead daughter. When the police arrived, they started to investigate the crime scene and discovered that the young woman had been strangled and had suffered severe injuries. Medical examiners determined that the young woman had been tied up and subjected to violence. The perpetrator had dealt her several blows, probably with a board or other heavy piece of wood, and then strangled her with an electric cable, which caused her death. Investigators were unable to find the board or the cable in the apartment, but they did find wood chips underneath Sheila's clothing and body. In 1982, professionals were able to remove biological evidence from the murderer, who may have been the murder weapon, but they could now perform a DNA test. The brutality with which the attacker treated his victim initially led the detectives to believe that this crime could have been committed haphazardly and that the perpetrator might be mentally unstable. However, it soon became evident that this attack was meticulously planned. First, there were no signs of forced entry on the door, which means that the attack was carried out without using force. Investigators believe that the perpetrator was not a first-time offender and may have been a serial killer or someone who had previously committed a similar crime because Sheila must have allowed the perpetrator in on her own. No one else in the apartment building heard anything, and the killer took a wire and a wooden board, depriving the police of 2 crucial pieces of evidence. Sheila chose the apartment because the rent was low and she could not afford to live in a more prestigious neighborhood on her salary from the supermarket. This only complicated the police's work since many people in the neighborhood knew Sheila. With almost no evidence, investigators started looking for witnesses. They interviewed all the building's residents, but none of them noticed anything suspicious that night. The first day, the police had the most obvious suspect. Sheila's boyfriend Stephen's statistics show that it is often people close to the victim who commit such crimes, and Stephen might have been the last person to see Sheila before the murder. He said he accosted her a month after the murder. Investigators carefully studied local residents and tried to identify who might be involved. They questioned about 70 men, but they were unable to establish their involvement. When local media learned that the detectives were considering Stephen as a suspect, they quickly learned that his family had strong ties to the police. His brother was the sheriff of Carson City, and his father previously held the same position before retiring, so as a result, newspapers started to smear the young man's name. The young man also had no alibi for the rest of that day, and was unable to prove that he did not enter Sheila's apartment. Residents of Carson City demanded that the teenager be immediately arrested, and some even called for the death penalty. The situation was further complicated by the Carson City residents' conviction that Stephen was responsible for the crime, and that his brother and father were using their position and connections to conceal it. This led to people protesting, writing angry letters to Stephen and his family, and even threatening violence. Investigators tried to determine if the boy had a motive for committing such a crime after speaking with Sheila's friends and learning that the couple had never experienced any significant issues and that the young woman had never complained of aggression from Stephen. In addition, the victims had serious injuries that required the killer to exert significant effort, and Stephen had a broken arm at the time. He was also arrested for being drunk in public. The detectives started to believe the boy was innocent as a result of this, but it was too late. Under pressure from the public's threats and constant accusations, Stephen committed suicide before he could be completely cleared of suspicion. As a result, the police had only one candidate for the murderer's role: David Winfield Mitchell, a gardener and handyman who was assigned to the apartment building where Sheila lived. However, there was no direct evidence pointing to Mitchell as the murderer. When suspicions against Mitchell started to grow, detectives re-interviewed residents of the complex and other employees to see if anyone had noticed any strange or suspicious behavior from the gardener, and in doing so, they learned that the man could enter any apartment in the complex to perform some repair work, and that shortly after the murder, he resigned and left in an unknown direction. The police tried to find him, but he seemed to have disappeared. When attractive young women passed by, he kept his eyes off them and watched them silently until they disappeared from view. Several tenants thought this was odd, and investigators began to suspect that he was the person who killed Sheila. A man was declared wanted, but over the following years they were unable to find him. Meanwhile, forensic scientists had one more trick up their sleeves. They discovered a hair in the victim's apartment that may have belonged to Mitchie. Tobago and experts were able to determine that the hair found matched his ethnicity. DNA analysis wasn't yet available in those days, so they couldn't determine a 100% match with Mitchell's DNA. In 1986, 4 years after the murder, the police finally received a lead on the man's whereabouts. He was living outside the state and was soon arrested. During questioning, Mitchell denied his guilt, and the detective said only one thing: a hair that presumably belonged to him. Investigators continued to suspect Mitchell of killing the young woman, but they lacked solid evidence and realized the case had no chance of success in court. As a result, they decided to free Mitchell because no judge would have found him guilty based solely on one hair, which could have in fact been left there during cleaning. Since that time, there have been no developments in this case. Sheila's mother learned about how new DNA analysis technologies could help solve such crimes and contacted the detective in charge of the case. The woman persuaded him to send the killer's biological material to the laboratory and request a comparison with Mitchell's. Since they couldn't prove the man's guilt, they practically put the investigation on hold until 1999, 13 years after the murder. After the 1986 interrogation, after a protracted wait, the investigators received the long-awaited results. The semen sample from the victim's body completely matched David Mitchell's DNA. Experts also concluded that the voice heard in the victim's apartment belonged to him. As a result, the police had 100% proof of Mitchell's guilt. However, Mitchell had returned to his native country and obtained employment as a security guard in a government institution. This presented a new challenge for the investigators. In order to extradite Mitchell, which was difficult, they had to go through all the bureaucratic red tape and demonstrate to the government of Trinidad and Tobago that Mitchell was the one who committed the murder. This process took several years, and federal authorities and the state government engaged in talks with the other state for the following 7 years, until 2006, when a decision was finally made to extradite him. The suspect was brought to Carson City, and soon one of the most high-profile murder cases in recent memory took place there. Second, journalists focused heavily on the fact that the victim's friend Stephen had committed suicide due to accusations against him. The court had to decide whether David was the real killer or whether the entire town mistakenly believed Stephen was guilty. Mitchell's attorney used these societal uncertainties in his strategy and insisted that David was not the real killer. They had another indirect argument on the day of the murder. Stephen had a cast on his hand. First, the young man was unlikely to have been able to inflict all these injuries on the victim with one hand. Second, particles of the cast would undoubtedly have been found at the crime scene, but there were none. The prosecution side refuted these arguments by citing compelling evidence that DNA testing in modern conditions has extremely low chances of error. In the late 1960s, when the suspect was living in New York, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison for assaulting 3 young women in their homes. Mitchell broke into their home, tied the women up with an electric cable, and subjected them to violence. After his release from prison, he moved. On the prosecution side, during the trial, they revealed information that had not been made publicly available before. In spite of his prior sentence, Mitchell received only 3 years in prison, of which he served 1.5 years, and was released on parole. He was then supposed to be deported to his native country. However, the man vanished from the police, moved to Carson City, and got a job as a gardener in that same complex, all the while avoiding capture. The young women managed to fight him off. They called the police, and 9 months later Mitchell was arrested. The investigation after Sheila's murder also raised concerns because the investigators had no knowledge of Mitchell's criminal history, contrary to the prosecution's version on the night of Sheila's murder. David knocked on her door and said that he had something he needed to do. If the system had not allowed him to leave so early, the young woman would likely still be alive. The same is true for the management of the residential complex, who, without knowing it, hired a serial rapist who fled from the police, which he used to stun the victim, and Mitchell committed all these crimes alongside her before fleeing the scene with the board and the electric cable. Because the jury reached a unanimous verdict in less than 30 minutes, David was given a life sentence without the possibility of parole, but his attorney argued for leniency by pointing out that Mitchell had been reformed and had lived an honest life for 25 years after the murder. David was 63 years old when we started his prison term. He spent most of his life on the run, and now he only has to spend the rest of his days in prison. Sheila's mother thanked the court for not allowing this monster to walk free. She claimed that if he hadn't been released early in the 1980s, her daughter would still be alive today. However, one question still remained that perplexed investigators. How did he get away with it? The offender was obviously serial, so it is likely that he may have attacked other women. He evaded capture for 25 years, so it is likely that his acts may have caused harm to other people. However, it is unclear whether the police will be able to find the truth. Share your opinion in the comments and don't forget to like this video. If you enjoyed it, thank you for watching. When a young woman went to the parking lot of her school to go to a sporting event, she disappeared without a trace. Soon, a very creepy discovery was made, and the police got involved. It took detectives 28 years to solve this creepy mystery, and none of them knew it would be the first of its kind. Sarah Yarborough was born in Portland, Oregon, on June 12, 1975. Her parents soon moved to a different state and settled in the town of Federal Way, which is close to Seattle and is basically a suburb of it. Had 2 brothers and helped her parents take care of the youngest one. She was close to him from a young age. Sarah was involved in music and ballet. She worked hard in school so she could get into a good college. Because of her good grades, she went to New Zealand twice as part of a school program. Later, Sarah joined her school's cheerleading team. She also had a lot of friends. Sarah was 16 when she went to an event with her cheerleading team. They met at the school building where the bus would pick them up. But Sarah got the time wrong. She thought the bus would pick them up at 8 a.m., but it was not supposed to come until 9 a.m. Sarah's friends started to arrive, but no one saw her. Some students saw her car in the parking lot, but there was no young woman. Students thought this was strange, but no one could reach Sarah because none of them had cell phones at the time. Around the same time, 2 12-year-old boys were walking around the school grounds. They saw a strange man come out from behind some bushes, look at them, and walk away in the opposite direction. The boys thought he was strange, but they did not pay much attention and kept walking. The children thought she was dead when they saw her lying on the ground with no signs of life. They ran home to tell their parents, and the parents of one of the boys went with him to the scene. The father of the other boy decided to follow the suspicious man the children had seen. His son told him that he saw a car that looked like a Chevrolet Nova pull away from that spot. Since he lived near the school, he went outside to try to find that car. At one point, he was able to. The man lost sight of it, and he could not find it again. In the meantime, the other boy's parents came to the school and realized that the young woman on the ground was probably dead. They ran to the school building and called the police. When the police arrived, they confirmed that the young woman was indeed dead. From the marks on her neck, they were also able to quickly figure out that the dead woman was Sarah. They concluded that the victim had probably been strangled. Officers found Sarah's shoes, pants, and socks, but nothing else. They found her purse and car keys inside the car in the school parking lot, which led them to think that she may have been attacked right next to the car and then dragged behind the trees. The body was taken to a medical examiner, and the police started looking for clues. Bushes near her body. They said he was a tall man in his early 20s with shoulder-length blonde hair, a dark raincoat, and black trousers. Soon, the police found another witness with a very surprising story. A man out for a jog saw a strange scene in the same wooded area. A young woman was lying next to some bushes, and a man was hovering over her. The young woman was not moving at all, so the witness thought that in both cases, the man and the young woman were still on the side of the road. It did not seem to him that a crime was being committed. The witness told the police that he had just moved to the U.S. from another country and did not know what was normal behavior there. However, he still gave the police a rough description of the killer that matched what the children said about him, who had been near the school, but no other useful leads were found. In the meantime, medical experts looked at Sarah's body and decided that this triangulation was the cause of her death. Apparently, the person who killed her used her own tights. In addition, a serious injury was found on the young woman's head. The experts thought that from this below, the victim lost consciousness, which was consistent with the runner's story. He saw that the young woman on the ground did not move at all. In almost every piece of Sarah's clothing, they found traces of male semen from the same person. However, in 1991, there was no common DNA database, so all the detectives could do was compare DNA samples from specific suspects. The medical examiner also told the detectives that Sarah's body showed no signs of sexual abuse, even though forensic scientists had found traces of male semen on her clothes. Sarah got to school almost an hour early, and she was the only one in the parking lot. Her killer probably saw her there and waited for her to get out of the car, then hit her on the head with something until she lost consciousness. He then dragged her from the parking lot and put her behind some trees, where her body was later found. The killer took off some of Sarah's clothes and did sexual acts on her before strangling her with her own belt. Police were able to find Sarah's body because it was in a Chevrolet Nova. However, they were disappointed to find out that the driver of that car had just been delivering donuts that morning. His DNA did not match that found on Sarah's clothes. It seems that the kids just saw the car driving down the road next to them and thought the killer was in it. Over the next few days, police continued to look for witnesses and new leads, but they did not make much progress. On Monday, school started again, even though all the students were horrified by what had happened. The murder had happened only a few meters from their school, and the killer's identity was still unknown. The young women were afraid. Teams arranged to walk each student to her car or bus so they would not be left alone on the street. Detectives found that there were about 70 potential witnesses in and around the school that morning, and they talked to each of them. However, they did not learn anything new. Based on what the two children and the jogger said, a rough sketch of the killer was made and sent to all local newspapers and TV stations. The story got a lot of media attention. Hundreds of tips came in, and investigators looked into each one, but none of them led anywhere. At one point, they got a tip about a man who fit the killer's description and had a criminal history, but his DNA did not match the killer's sample. Since then, the case has been on hold for many months. In total, the police got about 4,000 different leads, and they tried to follow each one, but they did not have enough resources. As investigators continued to look for the killer and new cases came up every month, time was also working against them. When Sarah's family found out that the police did not have enough resources to handle all the tips, her grandfather did what he could to help. He worked for a technology company and persuaded management to give the police department a very powerful computer with 150,000 memory chips. Still went along with it. With this computer, Police officers could store information about all the leads in one place, process them faster, and sort them in a way that made them easy to study. Despite this, every lead led them down a dead end, and in the years that followed, they made no progress. 2 years later, Sarah's classmates graduated, and before graduation, they decided to honor their friend. They raised a lot of money and used it to build a memorial to Sarah. In metal next to these things was a picture of the young woman's dog reaching for her purse. Over the years that followed, the case was reopened and all the evidence was looked at again, but the police were still unable to find out who did it. During this time, the police talked to thousands of people and took DNA samples from nearly 300 possible suspects, but none of this helped. In 2011, 20 years after the woman went missing, the case was still unsolved. He heard about a company that was working in the field of genetic genealogy. The policeman contacted the company and asked if they could try to find relatives of the person whose DNA was found on the victim's body. Unfortunately, they failed. In 2011, genetic genealogy was just starting to become popular, so the experts did not know how to search for both male and female relatives. DNA of a man, they could only look for family ties with other men, and vice versa. They also had to deal with laws that said they could not use genetic data samples to look for relatives of suspects. However, it did lead to some interesting results. For example, the team of researchers the detective approached had already been working for years to make a genetic pedigree of the first people who came to the United States. After looking at the killer Sarah's DNA, they found that he was related to one of the ship's passengers, Robert Fuller. However, it was almost impossible to track him down this way, since there were just over 100 people on the ship at the time. But over the centuries, they have had more than 25 million descendants. Also, the detectives did not know that he had made the Sarah Yarborough case the first of its kind, even though his idea was not new. The detective tried to use the information he had and tracked down several men with the Fuller surname who lived in his town at the time of Sarah's murder. He found photos of them and met the only witness, a jogger, and 2 men who had found the body as children. Unfortunately, neither of them recognized the killer in the photo. Finally, the investigators asked for DNA samples from every Fuller in the area and sent them to a lab. Experts found that one of the men was a distant descendant of Robert Fuller from that same ship. However, he was not the killer, and he did not even know that any distant relatives lived near him. The killer may have been so distantly related to him that his family never knew of the connection. The detective retired in 2017, and the case was given to a new team of investigators, TEST, in 2011. By that time, scientists knew a lot more about how to study genetic material, so they agreed to try to trace the killer's family tree. It took them 2 years. First, they used public databases to find even the most distant relatives of the killer. Then, they tried to manually trace their family ties to find people who lived in Federal Way at the time of Sarah's death. In total, they had to get rid of several thousand people before they found the right one. Sarah's clothes most likely belonged to one of her 2 brothers, who were 33 and 27 years old at the time of the murder. The older brother, Patrick Nicholas, turned out to be a violent criminal with a long criminal record. His DNA sample was in the FBI database, so he could not have killed Sarah because his DNA would have shown a match back in the 1990s. The younger brother, Patrick Nicholas, has also been on the police's radar for violent crimes, including crimes against children, but that was before the DNA samples of such criminals were added to the database. Detectives immediately set up a surveillance of the man. The man, who was 55 at the time, lived in a nearby town called Wellington. The police had been watching his every move for 2 days, and soon the chance came up. Patrick went to the laundry, and while he was waiting for his clothes to be washed, he went outside to smoke. The police put it in a bag marked evidence and went back to Patrick's car. The next time Patrick went outside to smoke, a handkerchief fell out of his pocket. The men did not pick it up and went back to the laundry room. The police were happy to take the second piece of evidence in case the experts could not get a DNA sample from the cigarette bite. However, the experts were able to get samples from all of these items easily, and the very next day they arrested the sperm that was found on Sarah's clothes in 1991 was a perfect match for Patrick's DNA. The judge immediately issued a warrant for the man's arrest, and the police took him into custody. It took 5 days from when investigators first learned his name to when he was officially charged with murder. When his biography was leaked to the media, many people began to ask why a man with such a criminal history was not even considered a suspect for all those 28 years. At age 19, Patrick Nicholas went up to a police officer and said, "I am the guy who killed my mother." Young woman, and got into her car, where he tried to abuse her. The victim was able to get away, but she had to jump into the river and swim for a long time to get far enough away. Patrick spent 4 years in prison, and then he was let out. The next time the police caught him, he was trying to abuse an underage young woman. He was arrested again, but his DNA was not in any database. Patrick's biological grandfather was adopted and grew up under the adopt-a-family name. One of the men who found Sarah's body as children in 1991 said Patrick was without a doubt the killer, and he admitted it. He was only 12 years old when the body was found, but the killer had known him for years. The witness was always afraid that the killer would come after him, and it was not until Patrick's arrest that he finally felt safe. Patrick's trial did not start until 2023. The man insisted he was innocent, and his lawyer tried to challenge the main evidence, DNA, which showed that Patrick's semen was on the victim's body. Lawyer also tried to question the accuracy of the DNA analysis, but experts said that those claims were completely false. Patrick was eventually found guilty of first-degree murder without premeditation. On May 25th, he was given a sentence of 45 years and 8 months in prison, which makes it very unlikely that he will ever get out. During the reading of that sentence, Patrick did not show any emotion, unlike Sarah's family, who spoke to the judge about how they were thinking about Sarah. Investigators for bringing the killer to justice, even though he had avoided justice for 28 years. Share your opinion on this story in the comments, and don't forget to like the video if you liked it. Thanks for watching. The student got off the bus and was nowhere to be found. Without a trace, her body was found in a field the next day. The police looked for the killer for 39 years, but it was not until 2019 that they were able to find out what really happened. We will tell you what happened. Helene Brzezinski was born on April 6, 1958, in Huntington, which is near New York City. She was the youngest of 3 children. Her older brother and sister were 12 and 9 years old, respectively. The girl grew up with love and care, got along well with her older relatives, and was a positive, bright person. When she was 14, her father got a job offer, and the family had to move to the small town of Hamilton near Boston. There, she went to the local school and developed a passion for after high school. She went to Wheaton College, which was 110 kilometers from her town. It was close enough for her to visit her family often, and it also had a great writing program. Helen got used to being a college student quickly. She did well in school and was involved in college life. Eventually, she got a chance she was excited about. She was going to do an internship at a radio news station in Denver, even though the city was more than 3,000 miles away from our college. Helene was excited about the opportunity. In addition, her uncle and aunt lived in Denver and agreed to take her in for the internship. She also went with a classmate who studied journalism in January 1980. Helen, then 21, flew to Denver and began working at a radio station. Every day she had to take the bus from the office to her home. The trip took about 30 minutes, after which she had to walk several miles. On January 16th, she left the radio station as usual at 6 p.m. and went to the bus stop. The only thing was that she never showed up at home. Her aunt immediately began to worry because Helen had always warned her before. If she planned to be somewhere late, the woman waited a few hours. But at 11:30 she decided to go to the police. After all, investigators had already begun a search, immediately fearing that her disappearance might be connected to a recent string of attacks on women in the area. They combed the area along Helen's route all night, but could not find her in the morning. A woman approached the police. She was driving her car through a suburban area of Denver with her children. At one point they noticed someone lying in a field near the road. The mother stopped. The car walked closer and saw the body of a young girl with no signs of life. The police arrived on the scene and immediately identified Helen. Her clothes were partially missing, her hands were tied behind her back, and all her personal belongings were also missing. Later, medical experts determined that the girl had been stabbed 9 times and abused. The death occurred between 8 and 10 p.m., A person who saw Helene get off the bus at 5:30 was able to be found by the cops. She had several kilometers to walk from the bus stop, and it appears that the perpetrator attacked her at that point. Law enforcement agencies surveyed the area near where the body was found, but they were unable to find almost any clues other than shoe impressions, presumably size 44, that led from the road to the body and back. By then, medical examiners had found biological material on the victim's body and clothing that appeared belonged to the killer, except that in those years it could not help the investigation because the science of studying DNA was only at an early stage of development. But the samples were sent to a laboratory for storage, hoping that they would help identify the perpetrator in the future. Police turned to the public for information using newspapers and local television. They tried to find witnesses who might have seen Helen that night. Soon they were approached by a woman who, at about 10:20 p.m., saw a man near the field where the body was found. He was standing on the side of the road next to a car. Unfortunately, it was dark outside at the time, and the woman could not get a good look at the man she provided the police with, only generalities that could not help them in any way. Then the detectives took a very interesting step with the consent of the witness. They invited a hypnotist to the station, and the woman was able to remember more details, on the basis of which it turned out to draw a portrait of this unknown man. It is hard to say whether the hypnosis session really helped the investigation, but the fact remains that at that time the police had nothing but this drawing, but they could not find a single suspect, and the case froze for years. Helen's college diploma was given to her after she died as a way to remember her. The school also named an alumni award after her because she was always involved in college life. The investigation was not reopened until 1998. 18 years after the murder by then, technology in the field of DNA research had progressed markedly, and researchers had entered samples of biological material into the FBI database. Unfortunately, no matches were found. This meant that the perpetrator had no previous criminal convictions, at least not since they began taking DNA samples from convicts. 15 more years passed, and in 2013 the local police department created a unit to handle unsolved cases. They reopened the investigation into Helen's murder, but no new leads could be found. A DNA sample from the victim's body never showed up in the FBI database. This meant the girl's killer had not come to the attention of the police for other possible crimes all this time. Throughout all these years, Helen's relatives and police were not the only ones trying to find the truth. The girl's high school friends with whom she was in the choir took an active part in the investigation. Decades after her murder, they continued to press detectives to review the case regularly. They also gave interviews to get the story out to the public and distributed flyers about Helen's murder along her bus route. In 2017, the case was reopened again, and this time the detectives had much more to go on by this point. Forensics had begun to make extensive use of genetic genealogy, by which the perpetrator's identity could be deduced through his relatives. Of course, this was a very complicated and time-consuming process. Moreover, this method worked only in the case if the relatives of the DNA possessor were in the publicly available genetic databases. There are several of these, and they are mostly used to search for family members. In 2018, police turned over available DNA samples to the Parabon lab, which had already helped solve hundreds of similar cases. Experts looked at about 3,000 matches, including even distant relatives of the alleged killer. They had to get rid of people who did not fit the age range or could not have committed the crime for other reasons. In the end, they decided that the person with the DNA was probably the son of a woman named June Estes, who was dead at the time. The problem was that she had 4 sons, but the lab was only able to identify 2 of them. They were 10 and 11 years old. A year went by before something unexpected happened. A woman named Jessie put her DNA sample into a public database, which was the best way to find criminals. Experts at Parabon saw that Jessie was a close relative of Helen's killer and contacted her. After a more detailed DNA test, they found that Jessie's 3rd cousin was the killer. Detectives asked the woman for information about her family to finally find the suspect. Immediately after uploading her data into the database, the woman began collecting information about her family tree and asked both of her parents to enter their DNA into the database. Through this, experts at Parabon determined that the killer was related to Jessie on her father's side. Unfortunately, the search for an answer will drag on for several more months. Expert detectives and Jessie's family worked together to get closer to the owner of the DNA from the murder scene, and soon it finally happened. The cops were able to reach a relative of June Estes, and he gave new details about her older sons. It turned out that the woman suffered from mental problems, and after her next breakdown, her father took the boys and took them to another town. Their names were William and Curtis, and the detectives were to find out which one of them was the killer. The answer was not long in coming. The Cavs immediately discovered that William had been incarcerated multiple times, and his DNA sample was entered into the FBI database in 2010. Given that the sample from Helen's body has been run through that database repeatedly since then, William was not the killer. The downside of this database is that it only shows a full match, not a partial match, even when brothers are involved. 39 years after the murder, the police had a prime suspect named Curtis White, who also went by the last name Clanton. It turned out that this man had a long criminal history. When he was 18, he knocked on a woman's door and asked to use her phone. Once inside, he grabbed a knife and abused the victim before running away. He was quickly caught and sentenced to 30 years in prison, but he was released after only 4 years because he was defended. Curtis moved in and got a job as a gardener in the area where Helen was killed. He later moved to Florida, which is where the officers went to look for him in 2019. Curtis was 62 years old at the time and worked as a trucker. Before charging him with Helen's murder, investigators wanted more hard evidence. After a week's surveillance, they got a hidden DNA sample from him, but it wasn't enough. Followed to a club, he confessed to a brutal murder. Life sentence granted at 82. Victim's family found closure after almost 40 years. Other cases possibly linked but unproven. Justice served partially. Share your opinion on this story in the comments and don't forget to like the video if you like it. Thanks for watching.
A 28-year-old woman mysteriously vanished from her own home, leaving her bedroom light on. They had been looking for her for months, and the story started to sound like a detective show. The police had barely looked into the case, so the missing woman's parents turned to an independent team of former detectives. It was only thanks to them that the horrible truth came out. Kate Waring was born and raised in Charleston, South Carolina. She had 2 boys and loving parents who tried to give them the best of all. Kate loved animals from a young age and started volunteering at animal shelters when she was in her teens. She also danced, had many friends, and was a very positive person. It seemed like the woman grew up in a good place, and in some ways she did. However, just before she went to college, she told her parents that someone close to her family had abused her as a child. To be found. This was a big surprise for Kate's parents, who had no idea what their daughter had been going through for years. After the woman told them this terrible secret, her parents did everything they could to help her, but the effects of such a trauma only got worse over time. First, Kate had problems with alcohol, and then with drugs. At one point, her parents suggested she get help, and she agreed, home and live with her family, which was also supposed to help her deal with her problems. At the time, Kate was an adult and living on her own, but she agreed to come home anyway. At first, therapy seemed to be helping, but Kate still could not let go of the past and start living life to the fullest. The psychiatrist she went to diagnosed her with depression, but at one point, everything changed. Her father, who constantly yelled at her, died, offered to take Kate on a trip anywhere in the world she wanted. The woman was excited by the idea and soon decided she wanted to go beyond the Arctic Circle. Her dream was to see polar bears. Even though she had been hurt by animals, they started looking for tours and soon bought tickets. They were going to get to the Arctic Circle by ship, and Kate could not wait for this exciting journey. At this point, Kate's parents watched as her depression got worse. When they finally went on the trip, Kate was thrilled. She and her father had a great time, and the woman gained a lot of good feelings on the ship that took them to the Arctic Circle. During the trip, Kate met another tourist from Russia. They talked and wrote to each other. By the end of the trip, Kate liked him, and after he went home, she decided to go to Russia. There, she met him again, and she even thought about staying in the country. Kate's visa was up for renewal, so she had to go back home. Despite this, it seemed like the woman had finally gotten over her depression. She planned to fix visa problems back home and even started writing a book for her kids. It seemed like her life was finally getting better. But on June 12, 2009, everything changed. Kate was home alone while her family was away on business. She always called her father to let him know she was okay, but she did not this time. He called Kate, but she did not answer. After a while, he asked his wife to come home and check on their daughter. Kate had had problems with alcohol and illegal drugs in the past, so her parents were still worried. When her mother got home, she did not find Kate there, but the light in her room was on. It looked like she had been out for a while and would be back soon. Her mother waited a few hours, but Kate still was not home. She also found that Kate had a home that needed to be taken regularly. Despite their worry, Kate's parents decided not to worry and wait for their daughter to show up. Kate was already 28 years old at the time, so they knew she could live her life. Kate's father decided to wait until Monday, when he would call the police. On Monday morning, the father got a call from the bank. An employee told him that a man had come into the office and tried to cash more checks. Kate worrying they could not get in touch with the woman herself, and her father was in charge of her account. The whole thing seemed very strange. The woman's father knew that his daughter only had a few $100s in her account, which is why the bank security service called him. They said the woman's signature looked real, and they gave the name of the man who had brought the check. His name was Ethan Mack, and he did not know him. Real One assumed that this man was a friend of his daughter's, but he still went to the police because Kate was still not talking to him. The police started looking into the man's disappearance, and the first thing they asked Ethan was about his relationship with the missing man. Ethan said that he had known Gay for years and that she had given him the check to pay off her old debts. He also said that he often gave her money for clothes, jewelry, and other purchases, confirmed that she and Ethan had been friends for a long time. According to them, they had never been in a relationship, but they had always been close. Ethan said that he and Kate met on Friday night and went out to eat at a restaurant. After dinner, he drove Kate home and went about his own business. He even showed the detectives letters from Kate that backed up what he said about the dinner. Ethan let the detectives look around his house, where he lived with his wife, and the situation with the check was still strange to the police, so they were not in a hurry to let him go. Eventually, Ethan called the police station and asked them to leave him alone. The police tried to piece together what happened on that Friday night when Kate was last seen. She went to see her therapist in the afternoon, then to the gym, then to the store, where she bought a bottle of wine. Surveillance cameras caught her talking to someone, but they could not figure out who it was. During the investigation, she may have been talking to Ethan, who later picked her up and took her to a restaurant. The woman's parents also remembered that on the day she went missing, Kate told them she was in trouble, but she would not say what it was about. They did not remember this until a few days later. Unfortunately, none of this helped in any way, and as the weeks went by and the woman was still missing, her parents thought the police were not doing enough. Kate Waring's case was given a second chance, and a group of former police officers led by a lawyer named Andy Savage took it on. This group had been looking into cold cases on their own, and Kate Waring's case interested them in particular. The group was made up of 5 men, all of whom had a lot of law enforcement experience. One of them was former Detective James Randolph, who first looked in Kate's bedroom. There, he noticed 2 suspicious things. The first was a package he was worried that she would never skip a drug on her own, and the fact that she had left the package at home was a red flag. Next, he found Chinese money on Kate's bed. This was strange, because Kate's parents had no idea where the woman got the money or why she needed it. Then, a team member named Bobby Minter got involved. He was an expert at finding information about people on the internet and finding them. His skills came in handy. Kate called her friend James around 10 p.m., but he did not answer. She left him a very disturbing voicemail in which she said that someone had stolen her credit cards. He went on to find out that her phone was last used at 1:53 a.m. when she called her own voicemail box number. For some reason, Bobby found out that the call was made from the James Island area, which was just a few miles from Kate's house. He talked to a few people he knew who lived in James Island and found out something strange. Ethan Mack, who had agreed to let the police check out his and his mother's house, did not actually live there. Instead, he rented an apartment in a nearby building. Eugene was very lucky to find out these details because one of his close friends turned out to be the owner of the apartment Ethan had rented. As the team of detectives dug deeper, they found out that Ethan Mack had the team decided to look into the case on their own. They found out that Ethan had a girlfriend named Heather Camp. When they asked Kate's parents if they knew the woman, Kate's mother told them a strange story about how she met Heather a month before she went missing. She and Kate were on the same train from Washington, D.C., where the woman was having trouble getting her visa to Russia. After meeting Ethan, the woman was going to Russia. Kate agreed to help and loaned her a certain amount of money. A few days later, Heather told Kate that her daughter had died in a car accident in New Jersey, which made no sense. Heather did not go to New Jersey, and her behavior suggested that her daughter's death did not bother her. Another strange fact was that an Indiana fraud case had been filed against Heller. This was because she was pretending to be a licensed doctor and forging the necessary documents. The team gathered a lot of information that made them look at the case from a different angle. They gave all of this information to the police, but they did not want to look into the case any further. The team realized that the only way to get the police to look into the case was to give them false information. In order to find out what happened to Ethan, the team took extreme measures. First, Eugene Frazier asked a friend who rented Ethan's apartment to put a hidden camera in front of the door. They also put a hidden GPS tracker on Ethan's car. This let the team track his movements and see what he was up to. It was not long before it paid off. After looking at Ethan's itinerary, the former detectives figured out that he had been to followed his steps and found out that at each of these pawn shops, the man sold different pieces of jewelry in small batches. Unfortunately, they could not find out if the jewelry belonged to Kate, but the detectives felt like they were getting close to a clue. After a while, they ran into a big problem. The owner of the apartment where Ethan and Heather were staying told them that he was going to kick them out for not paying rent. The team knew that if they moved out, they would lose, so they tried hard to persuade the owner not to do it. At the same time, the detectives quickly came up with a new plan. They asked the owner to give Ethan and Heather more time to pay their rent, but they had to sign a contract promising to pay it back. This trick worked, and as soon as the landlord gave the team this contract, they sent it to the lab. Their goal was to compare Ethan and he to see if they were the same person. Signature on the very check for $4,000. And here they have their long-awaited break. The specialist said with absolute certainty that the signature on the check was written by the same person who had signed Heather on the contract. This meant that it was Heather who had forged Kate's signature. But the team knew that the lazy police would not listen to them, so they came up with a new plan. Ethan that the apartment needed to be treated for bugs. The head of the team put on an exterminator suit and went to the apartment with the owner ahead of time. The detectives waited until Ethan left the apartment and noticed that his car had pulled away from the house. When James and the owner went inside, they got an unpleasant surprise. Ethan was at home. It turned out that Heather was driving his car, but it was too late to call off the whole operation, so James had to change his plans. James listened to the story about the need to get rid of the bugs and asked Ethan to wait outside the apartment while dangerous chemicals were sprayed. Ethan, who did not suspect anything, agreed and went outside. At the same time, James started to carefully search the apartment for any evidence that might link Ethan to Kate's disappearance. James looked in Ethan's backpack and looked at what was inside. Chinese money was the first clue, since the same bills were on Kate's bed. James could not find any more clues, so he and the landlord pretended to do the processing and left. The team had to come up with a new plan. When they looked at the camera footage in front of Ethan's apartment, they noticed that one man came in a lot. It turned out that this man was a neighbor of the couple named Terry Williams. The detective thought that Williams might know something about Ethan and Heather's role in Kate's disappearance, so they took a risk and decided to tell the police what Williams' friends had done to Kate. They took the bag of cash and went to Williams' apartment with this offer. However, the detectives were in for a surprise. When they knocked on Williams' door and told him about their offer, Heather was there and heard everything. It turned out that Heather was cheating on Ethan with Williams. When Heather heard the detectives talking to Williams, she got scared. She called Ethan and screamed. Williams. Over the next few days, they tried to figure out what to do next. But then another surprise happened. William called them and invited them to his house for a talk. When the detectives got there, he told them that Ethan and Heather had not told him anything directly, but he thought they had done something bad to Kate. He then took an iPod off the shelf and said that Heather had given it to him just days after Kate went missing. iPod. And thanks to the serial number, they were able to figure out that it did belong to Kate. This set of clues was enough to send the team back to the Charleston Police Department, and this time the local cops could not shrug off the job. After looking at everything the team had found, they finally arrested Ethan and Heather. At the first interview, Heather agreed to help with the investigation as long as the police helper got minimal punishment. Guatemala Island, about 20 miles from her home. The police sent out a search party and combed the area all day, but Kate's body was not there. It soon became clear that Heather had just lied to them. Andy Savage then came up with another plan. He knew that Heather was probably involved in Kate's murder, but he met with her and said he would help. Heather is sure that this is her only chance, and Kate agrees. She said that Kate's body is still on the outskirts of Guatemala Island, near Polly Point Road. She also gave a specific location. The detectives went there without the police, and they were disappointed when they did not find Kate. But the next day, they went back, and they did. The woman's remains were found, but medical examiners could not figure out what killed her. In August 2009, Heather signed a confession to murder, obstructing justice, and check fraud. The police found that the woman had been a con artist for years, and on that train from Washington, D.C., she chose Kate as her next victim. She later started dating Ethan, but he was not in a hurry to plead guilty, and his trial started in October 2010. On the day she went missing, Kate found out that Heather had cheated on her and stolen her credit cards. She threatened to tell her father, who would probably call the police. Heather told Ethan, who sided with her even though she had been friends with Kate for a long time. According to the investigation, Kate had dinner that night with Ethan and Heather. Heather was also there. Heather may have promised Kate that she would return the credit cards and money that were in Ethan's apartment. When all three of them got to the restaurant, Heather could not take it anymore and attacked Kate. The court did not believe Heather's story and gave her 39 years in prison. Ethan, on the other hand, got 25 years. The difference is because Heather was also charged with fraud. It could be the basis for detective movies. On the one hand, we have Kate, who was hurt badly as a child and turned to alcohol and other drugs. She found the strength to change her life for the better and beat her depression. On the other hand, we have the sad fact that her life was cut short by a mix of betrayal and greed. Ethan Mack was her close friend for years, but he killed her for the sake of his new lover. When they found out that the woman had a history of drug problems, they put the case on hold. This is where people with useful skills and a desire for justice came to the rescue. A group of independents did more than the entire police department, and it was only because of them that the killers were sent to jail and Kate's family was relieved of the heavy burden of ignorance. It is important to note that not a single police officer was involved in the case, to the truth. And what do you think about these minor infractions? Is it possible to use surveillance and fake searches to show that someone killed someone? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and if you like the movie, do not forget to click the likes button. During a fire, a 19-year-old student was discovered dead in her own apartment, but the fire was not the cause of her death at all. The detective realized right away that they were dealing with a murder, but there was little to no evidence to support their suspicions. The police have many suspects, but only one tiny, seemingly insignificant detail helped them solve the case. Missy Gruba was born on April 26, 1974 in the American city of Burleson, Texas. Because of her family's humble lifestyle, she worked a variety of part-time jobs during her school year to help pay for her own schooling. Missy decided that she wanted to be a teacher even before graduating, and in 1992, she enrolled at the University of Texas at Arlington, which was about 40 kilometers from her home. Missy also decided to rent a place closer to campus and work 2 jobs to pay her rent and tuition without the help of her parents. But sometimes even that wasn't enough to cover a bill. In addition, she received good grades and participated actively in the local church even before graduation. Despite having a busy schedule, Missy called her mother every day when she got home. It had become a tradition for them that their daughter would call her and let her know that she had returned from work, even if it was already night. On the evening of April 7, 1994, Missy also called her mother. They spoke for about 10 hours. The young woman was in the middle of her senior year of high school. Around 3 a.m., Missy's downstairs neighbor called the police to report hearing loud noises coming from the apartment upstairs, including breaking glass and banging. Thinking there might have been a robbery going on, she called the police. The squad arrived on the scene, and a short time later, the fire department received a call to the same address. It turned out that there had been a fire. Since the building was small, the firefighters were able to locate the source of the fire, which was Missy's apartment on the second floor. When the firefighters entered the apartment, they saw a terrible sight. The young woman was lying on the bed with no clothes on, and the fire was raging all around her. The firefighters immediately realized she was dead so as to evacuate the residence. When the firefighters first arrived at the young woman's apartment, they smelled a strong gasoline odor. After thoroughly inspecting the apartment, the firefighters were confident that they were dealing with intentional arson. Someone had stabbed the young woman several times, leaving numerous bloody wounds on the bed. As for the fire itself, the firefighters immediately believed that it was purposeful arson, as well as when they first arrived at her apartment they smelled a strong gasoline odor. Dead young woman inside, but the arsonist had shut the front door, reducing the size of the fire and making it difficult for the flames to continue to burn. The police quickly identified the deceased as Missy Gruba, and while her body was handed over to the medical examiners, they came to the conclusion that she had passed away before the fire began. This was supported by the stab wounds on her body and the absence of smoke. They also discovered that the girl had been abused and were able to obtain a sample of the abuser's DNA as a result. The police discovered a knife in Missy's apartment that they believed to be the murder weapon, but there were no prints on it, and it appeared the killer had washed it in the sink before setting it on fire. The DNA sample from the victim's body was also ineffective. The police had their first lead almost immediately because it turned out that Missy had filed a police report on a coworker she had worked with at the coffee shop. A young guy had lost his place and was looking for someone to stay with for a while until he could find a new apartment of all his coworkers. Missy was the only one who agreed to help and let him stay with him regardless of her. The coworker only stayed there for a few days. One day, Missy returned from work and was about to deposit the day's tips into her piggy bank. She continued to set aside small sums to supplement her tuition and rent until she had nearly $1,000 saved up. However, that day, the young woman discovered that all of her money had vanished. Since no one else had spare keys, she immediately accused her coworker. He denied wrongdoing, but Missy insisted. When the young woman went to the police, the man may have harbored resentment toward her and decided to exact revenge. If he hadn't known that Missy had already done so, he might have killed her just to prevent her from doing it. The police began looking for this man. He had quit his job and vanished, so the investigators had a pretty good suspect. The man had the keys to Mrs. apartment, so he had no trouble getting in. The letters were found in the victim's apartment, and judging from their contents, he and Missy were having some sort of relationship. They didn't live too far apart, but they frequently wrote to and from each other. The young woman was a devout Christian who had never had a boyfriend. She also mentioned in her letters that she wouldn't be ready for an intimate relationship until she was married. Her companion initially shared this viewpoint, but over time the letter's contents grew more explicit. The detectives were pleased with their discovery and decided to run the man through the database. To their surprise, they learned that he had a prior conviction for violent crimes. Given that Missy had also been seen before the murder, this was enough to make the young man a suspect. He was found and questioned, but he denied any involvement and had no good alibi. The boy claimed he was sleeping alone in his house when Missy was killed, but Missy was killed between midnight and 3 in the morning. So his claim had a third suspect. The management of the cafe where Missy worked told them about an incident that occurred just before her death. The young woman reported to the manager that one of her coworkers Jeff had stolen some items or money from the cash register. The theft charges were confirmed and the man was fired afterwards. He later caught up with Missy and started accusing her of losing his job and leaving him without a livelihood. During this conversation, he said he was going to kill himself. During all of this was more than enough for the police to question the man. But while the detectives were attempting to learn his address, something unexpected occurred. Jeff's girlfriend entered the station and claimed she was afraid of her boyfriend and suspected him of killing Missy. It turned out that the man had not been home the night of the murder and he had never been there before. When he was found and brought in for questioning, Jeff acted very brazen and kept smiling. He bombarded the detectives with various stories that were inconsistent with reality, claiming that Missy was actually obsessed with him and wanted to date him, and that was why his behavior was so bad. The man repeatedly mentioned the story that he had been fired because of a complaint from Missy, and he had been furious about what she had done. When the detective said that Jeff's girlfriend denied this alibi and that he was at home with her the night of the murder, he just laughed and said that Jeff did agree to provide his DNA sample voluntarily, given that there was no evidence against him and the DNA analysis could have taken over a month. However, a few days later, Jeff's girlfriend called the police, upset, and reported that the man had kidnapped her. He held her hostage for 8 hours, threatening to kill her if she tried to flee. Eventually, he released her, and the young woman immediately called the police. They started looking for Jeff right away, but he had already escaped. Despite this, the detectives were almost certain that he was responsible for Missy's murder. They put out a search for him on a kidnapping charge, but the man seemed to have vanished. Meanwhile, experts at the lab were able to almost certain that Jeff was the murderer, but the lab's results disproved the theory. As a result, they were left with only one suspect who had not provided his DNA sample and who had not yet been found. A colleague of the victim who she had allowed to stay with her, but a month had passed since the murder and the police were shocked to learn that both samples from Jeff and Missy's boyfriend had a different blood type. As mentioned earlier, Missy occasionally worked as a nanny. One of her regular clients was a young couple who lived in the same complex. They had a young child and the woman was pregnant with her second or partners. Missy's mother called the investigators and said she remembered a strange detail the young woman had told her on the phone a few days before she died. She didn't give it much thought and didn't decide to share with the police until a month later. According to the mother's account, a few days before her daughter's death, a man came to Missy's house to talk. Even though it was getting close to nightfall, she let him in. Lewis told her that his relationship with the young woman had been strained recently and that he just needed someone to talk to, but what followed was something that struck the police as extremely strange. Missy said to her mother that after the chow, Lewis told her that he was going to. Detectives found it difficult to believe that a 32-year-old man and his father would visit a 19-year-old woman's home at midnight and then engage in a pillow fight. But according to Missy's account of the incident, that is exactly what happened in a conversation with her mother. Missy didn't give it much thought, but the police decided to check on the man and discovered that Lewis had no criminal history, had served in the army, and was a model employee at the restaurant. But Lewis said, "I hope they catch whoever killed and raped Missy as soon as possible." He later added that they might never find the offender because all the evidence was destroyed in the fire. The problem was that the police never revealed that the victim had been abused before she died. It wasn't in the newspapers or reports, and it wasn't mentioned in any interviews. The man was calm and forthright in his responses to all of the police inquiries until the detectives asked him for a DNA sample, at which point Lewis became visibly nervous and questioned why they needed his DNA since the fire was supposed to destroy all traces of the perpetrator and his sample would have nothing to compare it to. The man said that he and Missy did talk a lot, but that he had nothing to do with her murder. Lewis' behavior changed dramatically when the detectives told him they had a sample of the killer's DNA. He said he urgently needed to take his child somewhere and left the station promising to return the next day to take the DNA test, but he never did. It is important to note that the police also withheld the fact that the experts received a sample of the killer's DNA, so no one knew whether they had this evidence or not. Man was no longer working there. The manager reported that the man's girlfriend had called and asked for Lewis to take a few days off because he had to leave town. Additionally, the detectives learned that Lewis had married his girlfriend the day after he was questioned. At this point, they could only speculate as to the motivation behind the marriage, but first they decided to speak with his wife, who revealed that Lewis had called her from work the day of the murder and announced that he was going to leave town. Lewis told his wife that he had run by Missy's house and noticed the fire. He went up to her apartment and saw that the place was engulfed in flames and the young woman herself was lying on the bed. Lewis tried to save her by giggling. He returned after 2 a.m. and his wife noticed that he smelled strongly of smoke and gasoline. The man was also coughing constantly and his nose had traces of soot. His wife asked him what had happened, forced him to run outside. Reportedly, his wife was pleased with the story, and they went to bed. As you have already realized, the detectives found a number of suspicious points in the story, even setting aside the fact that the man decided to go for a run in the middle of the night. His further story defies any sense of reason. First, how could he have gotten into Missy's apartment without keys after the fire? Forensics found no evidence of forced entry on the door. According to Lewis's account, he entered the victim's apartment after she had already passed away. Additionally, if his account is to be believed, Lewis decided to go to bed after witnessing the death of a young woman he had known for a year and a full-fledged fire in the home next door. His wife, it appears, did not feel the need to intervene either. The police also learned Lewis's blood type from his wife, and it matched the blood type found on the victim, sufficient to place a man on the wanted list. But his whereabouts remained unknown. The wife also claimed that she didn't know where her husband had gone, but the detectives didn't believe her by that point. Instead, they suspected that the woman was purposefully protecting Lewis because, in their opinion, he had given her a significantly altered account of the murder in which he had no choice or Missy had attacked him herself. In other words, he had persuaded her under false pretense immediately after Lewis's wife gave them information about where he might be. Police from the city of San Antonio discovered a burnt-out car that belonged to Lewis and that his mother lived in the same city. Detectives went there and found the man, who was then arrested at the station. He acted extremely tense, lying on the floor sobbing, and generally looked like he was on the verge of a breakdown. Lewis's story then turned genuinely bizarre when he said he didn't remember how events unfolded after that, but he may have stabbed her while denying that he had set the apartment on fire. The man did not actually deny his involvement in setting the fire. This account did not go well with the fact that the young woman's body was found with many wounds and bruises, let alone the fire. Given that Lewis did not directly confess, the case went to trial, and the man continued to maintain that he and Missy had a consensual, intimate relationship that night. This made the detectives' job difficult, but now they could take a sample of his DNA at that point. They already knew that Lewis's blood type matched the killer's, and all they had to do was wait for the DNA results. Eventually, the experts found a perfect match, and Lewis was charged with murder. According to the investigation, Lewis claimed that he did not remember stabbing Missy but did remember getting a knife from the kitchen. He also claimed that he remembered that there was a fire in the room but that he did not start it. Lewis had long had a crush on Missy and was even somewhat obsessed with her because of this one intriguing fact. He had lived in her condominium and worked in the same restaurant as her for almost a year. In addition, in the days prior to the murder, Lewis had visited Missy around midnight for no apparent reason, which also seemed odd to the investigators. According to their version, Lewis had gone to her apartment on the night of the murder in order to persuade Missy to have intimate contact with the young woman who was the victim of the murder. There were hundreds of similar complexes in their city, so it would be logical to assume that Lewis had chosen this particular place in order to live closer to Missy. Possibly the story about the run and the attempt to save Missy came about only after investigators began to suspect Lewis and informed him that the fire had not destroyed the killer's DNA. Upon learning this, Lewis could have persuaded his wife to believe the story about the run and the attempt to save Missy. He and Lewis flew into a rage. He abused her, then killed her, and went to get gasoline after setting the apartment on fire. He returned home and told his wife some made-up story in which detectives theorized that Lewis had married her only so she would be legally entitled to not testify against him. As for Lewis himself, the court sentenced him to life in prison with the possibility of petitioning for parole in 2034. However, aside from the young woman receiving CPR, it appears that his wife really didn't know the truth. She was also not charged in any way. The court determined that he had long sought to seduce the young woman and eventually decided to commit the crime, after which he saw only one way out: to kill Missy to avoid prison. As a result, the court concluded that he had long sought to seduce the young woman and eventually decided to commit the crime, after which he saw only one way out: to kill Missy to avoid prison. The police were able to solve a very complicated case in which the most improbable was the culprit they only attracted attention to. Louis may have gotten away with it if it weren't for that small detail, and Jeff was eventually apprehended and sentenced to 4 years in prison for kidnapping his own girlfriend. Share your opinion on this story in the comments, and don't forget to like if you liked the video. Thanks for watching. A 16-year-old girl went out for a run and disappeared. The police launched an investigation that would eventually last for 38 years. When the truth did come out, people were literally shocked. It turned out that the case could have been solved in just a few weeks, but instead, it took almost 4 decades to find answers. In this video, we tell you what happened to Joyce McLean. Joyce McLean was born on September 4, 1963. When she was young, her family moved to a tiny town called Melnakit, located almost on the edge of the United States. From an early age, she had a passion for music. The girl quickly mastered several instruments, but her favorite was the saxophone. She loved to compose her own compositions and was a member of the school music group. In addition, she was a member of the cheerleading team, played soccer, and in general was a very active participant in school life. At the end of the summer vacation in 1980, Joyce was preparing for her approaching age of 17. She had only recently received her driver's license, and she planned to go to the lakeshore with her friends and relatives to celebrate her birthday. She was even going to invite a local musical group to celebrate her birthday. Joyce had 2 more grades to finish, after which she planned to go to college. The girl was preparing for this in advance, so she studied only with honors, as well as earning various sports and musical achievements. On August 8th, she and her friends spent the day at the lake. Afterward, she decided to go for a run. Joyce loved sports, but running was not her favorite activity. Despite that, she was going to play in high school soccer games during the new school year, and she made every effort to keep herself in shape. The girl went out for a run at about 7:30 p.m. Normally, she would run with her friend, but she was busy that night. Joyce had a standard route. She would do a few laps on the road that went around her tiny town. It usually took about an hour, but that night, the girl never made it home. Several hours had passed since Joyce had left, and her mother was beginning to get seriously worried. The girl always let her parents know where she was going, and if she had gone for a walk with friends after her run, her parents would have already known about it. Her mother decided to go looking for her and drove around town in her car. She asked around all the neighbors who came her way, but no one had seen Joyce. Considering the vast majority of the people in this small town knew each other, a few more people joined the search. Night was approaching, and the girl was still nowhere to be found. Then the concerned parents decided to call the police. Local officers immediately joined the search, and in the hours that followed, more and more citizens took to the streets. They combed the route Joyce was running, as well as the area behind the school. Unfortunately, there was no sign of Joyce. With each passing hour, panic increased, and there was little hope of finding Joyce alive and unharmed. It was the middle of the night, and the police had completely ruled out the possibility she might have gone out with some friends. The problem was that everyone she knew was at home and later joined the search. Joyce's parents simply couldn't imagine their daughter deciding to go out alone until very late at night. They were unable to locate her, and the search dragged on for 2 days. During that time, police officers, along with residents, continued to explore the area until they finally made the heartbreaking discovery on August 10th. Joyce's body was found just 60 yards from the school playgrounds, not far from the trees. The girl was lying on the ground. Virtually all of her clothes were missing, and her hands were tied behind her back with a piece of blue cloth. The police immediately realized that the victim had been hit hard in the head, but a more detailed analysis was to be done by a medical expert. After examining the body, they concluded that the girl had received multiple blows to the head and that her death occurred on the evening of the same day she disappeared. Despite the almost total lack of clothing, the unknown perpetrator did not abuse her. Unfortunately, no other information could be obtained. There were no foreign DNA samples on the body, and even in the early 1980s, the technology was only in its infancy. The first person in history to be convicted thanks to DNA testing was not arrested until 1987. So, the police were faced with a complex investigation with a minimal set of clues. Shortly after the discovery of the body, officers discovered Joyce's clothes, but that did not bring them any closer to a solution either. News of the brutal murder quickly spread through the town, plunging it into a very grim state. As is usually the case, the inhabitants of such tiny towns in the middle of nowhere had never encountered a murder. Adding to the anxiety was the fact that the killer was still out there, and his identity remained unknown. Given the complete lack of evidence, several theories swept through the town. The most popular theory was that Joyce's body had been found near a place where less fortunate youths congregated. They often drank alcohol there at night and also took illegal substances. People thought that a group of such tipsy guys might have molested Joyce and things got out of hand. The police even checked with locals who regularly spent time in those groups, but they were unable to establish their involvement. Another theory was that the killer might have been a man who came for seasonal work. Hundreds of people came to this area on a regular basis since there were not enough local people to fill all the jobs. But even here, the police could not find any evidence. Some even began to suspect the volunteer who discovered Joyce's body. The fact was that he had spent most of his time surveying the area in tandem with another volunteer. On the morning of the last day, however, he went out to search alone. Because of this, there was a theory that he was involved. But even here, the police could not confirm his guilt. There was another version. It turned out that the same night Joyce disappeared, there had been a serious accident not far from the city. A 19-year-old local resident had snuck into a garage and stolen a gas tanker before crashing into another vehicle. He sustained serious head injuries and slipped into a coma for 9 days, making it impossible for the police to question him. And when he woke up, he pleaded not guilty. The investigators didn't know what to do next. They had no evidence or witnesses. As a result, the case went into a long drawer for years, during which time the police were unable to get any closer to a clue. 8 years later, Joyce's relatives created a petition calling for coverage of their daughter's murder on a national unsolved crime show. This would get the word out to viewers across America and draw the attention of potential witnesses. There is always the possibility that someone heard or saw something but, for some reason, did not report it to the police. The petition gathered 6,000 signatures, and the authors of the program agreed to do their own story. It was broadcasted in 1989, and the police did indeed receive a lot of appeals, but all of the collected information turned out to be either erroneous or outright false. Unfortunately, this happens in almost every well-known case. People either make mistakes or simply lie and fabricate non-existent facts, forcing the police to waste time and resources on checks. The case stalled for several more years, but all the while, Joyce's mother continued to fight for the truth. In the mid-2000s, she decided that new technology and techniques in forensics could help uncover evidence that had been missed in the 1980s. To do so, experts needed to exhume the victim's body, but there were challenges. Initially, authorities denied the mother's request for an exhumation. They believed that in almost 3 decades, any possible evidence simply had not been preserved. But the woman continued to insist, and in 2007, she managed to move the issue forward. The medical expert Peter Cummings of Massachusetts contributed greatly to this effort. He was born in East Mill Market and was only 5 years old at the time of Joyce's murder. Despite such a young age, he remembered well the horror in which his town had been plunged. Peter admitted that it was these events that guided him into the field of forensics and medicine. When he learned that the authorities had rejected Joyce's mother's petition for an exhumation, he contacted her and asked her not to abandon the idea. Peter believed that the remains might have been preserved enough to try to extract evidence from them. He also contacted one of the leading forensic experts in the United States, and he took an interest in the case. Joyce's mother decided to take the initiative and organize an independent examination. The exhumation required about $20,000, which the family did not have, but they had the support of concerned people who, after so many years, still remembered the case. With their help, the family quickly raised the necessary amount, and the exhumation took place in 2008. To the surprise of many, Experts did unearth some important evidence, but at the time, they kept this information secret. Investigators only said that the discovery would not be followed by any immediate arrest, but the police immediately reopened the case. A few months later, it was reported that unidentified people had desecrated Joyce's grave. The police said they did not know if it had anything to do with the murder investigation. The next major twist came a year later, in 2009, and that moment may have been pivotal, as law enforcement announced a prime suspect for the first time in 29 years. Let's take it back to 1980 as we recall a few hours after Joyce's murder. A local man stole a gasoline truck and got into a serious accident, causing him to fall into a coma. That man was 19-year-old Scott Fournier, and in 2009, he was put on the bench for possession of illegal material with minors. It seemed like the two cases were unrelated, except after the sentencing. The judge suddenly announced Scott as a person of interest in the Joyce McLean murder case, urging the man to confess to what he had done. This news greatly surprised Joyce's relatives. They were well acquainted with Scott and knew that the police were considering him as a suspect because of that accident. But why had a judge officially declared him a person of interest after a long 29 years? The lead detective in the case declined to comment on the situation. He only said that they had made significant progress since the exhumation, and the investigation was well underway. Scott was already 55 years old at the time and refused to plead guilty. The case went to trial, and he spent nearly 2 years in jail awaiting his first hearing because he didn't have $300,000 for bail. The trial didn't begin until 2018, and the public finally learned something really strange. It turned out that Scott had repeatedly confessed to killing Joyce just weeks after the fact. On one occasion, he cried and confessed to his mother and sister that he had killed Joyce. On other occasions, he told a local priest, an acquaintance of a married couple, and a co-worker of his. Some of these confessions did not reach the police until years later, but some became known almost immediately. Scott was questioned, but he began to deny his guilt. He referred to the head injury he sustained in the accident. According to him, he really thought he killed Joyce but now believes that in reality, it never happened. He was questioned a total of 27 times, and Scott kept changing his story. At first, he told the police that he killed Joyce by stabbing her several times with a glass insulator from a power line that was lying nearby. The girl was indeed killed right under the power line. Scott further stated that he tied her hands, abused her, and fled. The police were confused by one fact in this story. Firstly, they were unable to identify the exact murder weapon, even though a glass insulator was found near the body. Second, Joyce had not been abused, as the medical examiner's report attested. But otherwise, his story was very close to the truth. In the following interrogations, he stated that he had killed Joyce in the company of other guys. Then he said he had just watched them attack her. He then changed his statement again and said that these guys forced him to participate in the crime. There were many stories like this, and during the investigation phase, the detectives just got confused. They had no hard evidence against Scott, and his story changed every time they questioned him. For this reason, he was not arrested all those years. It was only in time that they managed to gather enough evidence to bring the case to trial. 2 witnesses helped in this, a priest and a colleague of Scott's who both heard him confess. The colleague asked Scott how he got away with it, and Scott replied that he had simply filled the police with false accounts of other people's involvement, and that it threw them off the scent. The colleague reported the conversation to his superiors but not to the police. Apparently, they never passed the information on to law enforcement. He admitted to the priest that he did not abuse Joyce because she was on her period at the time, and that was a key factor. The police never divulged this information, although they became aware of it after examining the girl's body. It turns out that Scott simply could not have known such details unless he himself was the killer. Scott's attorneys insisted that all the evidence was circumstantial. They wrote off their client's confessions to the head injury he sustained in the accident. They also cited the fact that the police did not arrest him immediately after he first confessed to the murder. In addition, the attorneys rebuked the court for refusing to consider other suspects. For example, they tried to pin the blame on the man who discovered Joyce's body, Peter Larley. That morning, he was to go in search of the girl paired with another volunteer. They had arranged to meet at 6 a.m., but Peter never showed up. Later, the volunteer learned that he had gone out early and found the body. But there's an odd point here too. This volunteer's sister lived next door to Peter, and on the morning of that day, she saw the man leave the house at dawn. According to the woman, he had a large gym bag in his hands, and when he returned home after finding the body, he looked happy and smiling. This story seems dubious, if only for the reason that the volunteer did not report all of this to the police until 16 years after the murder. That already seems strange, and it is impossible to verify the authenticity of his words. Unfortunately, Peter Larley died of a heart attack just 2 days before Scott's arrest. For this reason, no one will ever know why he came out earlier, but the police said that there is no evidence that he was involved in the murder. The prosecution denied all the arguments of the defense. They assured them that the police had looked at all possible suspects and had not been able to find even a hint of their involvement. Scott, on the other hand, gave many reasons for suspicion. Even his stepfather told the police early in the investigation that he suspected Scott of the murder. According to him, a few days before the incident, the boy said he planned to start running in the evenings. He also mentioned that he felt sympathy for Joyce. Moreover, when Scott first confessed to the murder, he was asked to show where he had attacked Joyce. The boy led investigators to the exact spot where the body was found. They cited several other witnesses to corroborate the theory that he was involved. On the evening of Joyce's murder, at about 9 p.m., a couple saw Scott run by the scene of Joyce's murder with a bottle of liquor in his hands. Except, according to them, an unknown young man was running beside him. They didn't know at the time that's where the girl's body would be found, but they later reported it to the police. An hour and a half earlier, 2 local teenagers had also seen Scott and an unidentified young male running through that area. The trial lasted just over 2 weeks, and the final verdict was handed down on February 5, 2018. Scott was found guilty of Joyce's murder, sentencing him to 45 years in prison. At the time, the man was 57 years old, a sentence that virtually guaranteed he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. In 2019, Scott's attorneys appealed, which helped them schedule a new hearing. The court, however, did not change the original sentence. According to the judge, the evidence against the perpetrator was exhaustive, and all the arguments of the defense had no weight. Joyce's relatives lifted from their shoulders the heavy weight of ignorance that had been with them for 38 years. All the time, they had fought for the truth, and it was her mother who contributed the most. This woman dedicated her life to getting justice. Eventually, she went even further and helped pass a law that enabled the authorities to start allocating substantial funds for the creation of unsolved homicide squads. One obscure point remains in the whole story. Who was the other guy seen by witnesses? Scott's involvement here is almost obvious. He knew so many details that the police never disclosed publicly. It just can't be written off as conjecture. But what about the 2 groups of witnesses who told the police the same thing? Could it be that Scott committed this crime in the company of some other person? This point is also questionable. After Joyce was killed, Scott stole a gasoline truck and had an accident, but he was the only one in the car. Where did his supposed partner go? Is it possible that they separated immediately after the murder? And yet, the version of the second killer seems dubious. Share your opinion on this story and don't forget to like if you liked the video. Thanks for watching. This gruesome story that took place in England over the years has become one of the most famous criminal cases in the country. A young woman was killed while walking in the park with her 2-year-old son. Who was the only witness? The police couldn't find the perpetrator for 16 years, and when the case was finally solved, they were accused of catastrophic mishandling. It turned out they had committed numerous mistakes that cost the lives of many people. In this video, we will show you how a single murder case evolved into something much larger over 16 years and how it all came to an end. Was born on November 23, 1968, in a village near Colchester, England. She grew up in a decent full family. Her father was an army officer, and her mother was a housewife. From an early age, the young woman took part in various volunteer programs helping the elderly and children with disabilities. At age 11, she enrolled at Colchester High School for Girls, where she was active in dance, singing, and acting. All of her teachers insisted that the young woman had real talent and should develop in that direction. However, Rachel herself was more deeply into the study of history and English. After school, she got a job as a lifeguard at the pool in Richmond. Rachel later planned to try her hand at hosting a television program for children in 1988 when she was 20 years old. Rachel met her future husband, Andre. The couple began dating, and a year later, they had a son, Alex, together. They moved to an area of London called Belham. By then, she had already been offered a job as a model, but she decided to devote her full attention to her family for a few years and then tried to get a job in television. On a summer morning, July 15, 1992, Rachel took her son and their Labrador for a walk in the local park. At the time, Alex was only a month away from his 3rd birthday. This park in Wimbledon's Common neighborhood was popular with the locals. There were always a lot of people there during the daytime, mostly parents with children and dog walkers. Despite this, because of the large area and the abundance of greenery, it was always possible to get away from prying eyes and enjoying nature and solitude. Unfortunately, there was a downside to this. At about 10:06 a.m., a woman walking in the park noticed a gruesome scene. A young woman was lying on the ground. There was a lot of blood around, and a small child was sitting next to her. The victim was Rachel. Several dozen police officers arrived on the scene. They had to cordon off an area of 4 square kilometers where there were hundreds of potential witnesses and possibly the killer. Detectives soon realized that none of the park's visitors had seen either the moment of the attack or the killer himself. No one except for one witness, Rachel's son Alex. They were to get all the information from the 2-year-old boy. Of course, this was extremely difficult to do. The child was first admitted to the hospital for examination to make sure he was not injured. Later, the detectives did get some information from him. He said he and his mother were approached by a tall, thin white man with brown hair. Everyone in the park was questioned. It took the police almost an entire day, but it only took a few hours for reporters to get the whole country to hear about this gruesome crime. Rachel's case instantly caused a wide resonance, which is not surprising. A young mother died in front of her child in one of the most popular parks in London. Residents of Britain were even more shocked when the newspaper leaked information from the pathologist's report. Rachel had been stabbed 49 times with a sharp object. There was enormous pressure on the Metropolitan Police. Society demanded that the sadists be caught and punished as quickly as possible, and detectives did indeed have to work at an accelerated pace. In the first few weeks, they interviewed 548 men, 32 of whom were even arrested for a short period of time. But all to no avail. The police simply had no leads. The only thing the experts were able to find was a tiny piece of organic material that they thought might be connected to the killer. But in 1992, technology simply didn't allow them to study it. By September, investigators were left with no suspects, so they enlisted the help of Paul Britton, a renowned profiler, to compile a description of the killer. Here's what he came up with. He is a man in his late 20s to early 30s, most likely living alone. All of his hobbies are also socially unrelated. He's interested in knives and the occult and has sadistic fantasies. In addition, he lives near the park at the request of the police department. This profile, along with this catch, was shown on television. After that, they received at least 4 calls, all with the same matching name, Colin Francis Stagg. In addition to the fact that he fit the sketch, the police ran his name and realized that he had already been on their radar. The fact is that the stag had tried to enter the park the day Rachel was killed. Colin Stagg, 27, had led a secluded lifestyle. He had lost his job and was struggling to find money to pay for housing and food. He had a dog that he walked every morning in Wimbledon Common Park. According to his testimony, on the day Rachel was killed, he went there with his dog, but because of a severe headache, he quickly went home and went to bed. Toward evening, he felt better and decided to take his dog out for a walk again. However, on this approach to the park, he was stopped by the police. Stagg calmly answered all questions and gave his details. The police had no evidence against Stagg, but he seemed to them to be a suitable candidate for the role of the killer. In addition, the press kept pressuring law enforcement agencies, and they needed a breakthrough in the case urgently. That same day, Stagg was brought to the police station where he was held for 3 days. When questioned, he denied any involvement in the murder, but the detectives were beginning to believe more and more the opposite. First, occult books were found in his home, which coincided with the profiler's suggestion. Second, the police were able to find 2 women who gave some disturbing details about Stagg. One woman accused him of exposing himself in front of her in that very part. In his defense, Collins said he was just sunbathing in a secluded part of the park, and the woman came there herself. Another woman reported that she had been exchanging intimate letters with him for some time in one of them, and he confessed to her that he dreamed of having sexual intercourse outdoors. All this was already enough for the police to consider Colin a pervert and finally believe his involvement in the murder of Rachel, except they knew that all these circumstantial arguments would not stand a chance in court. For this reason, the man had to be released on the advice of his lawyer. He agreed to pay a fine for exposing himself to a woman in the park, though he continued to insist on his innocence. Detectives, along with a profiler, came up with a very unusual plan that was supposed to help force a confession. A Metropolitan Police officer under the pseudonym Lizzie James began writing Colin letters of intimate content. She said she knew the woman Stagg had corresponded with before. Despite the ridiculousness of the situation, the plan worked. Colin responded to all the letters, and each time their dialogues became more and more explicit and perverted. Lizzie played the part of a woman with violent and sadist hobbies, sometimes even illegal, and their communication lasted 5 months. All this time, Stagg insisted that they finally meet in person, and the detectives decided it might actually help to get a confession out. The location and date was set at a park. Lizzie didn't go there alone, but Stagg didn't know that plainclothes officers were keeping an eye on them in case the man decided to attack their colleague during the conversation. Izzy, on the provider's advice, shared with Colin a fictional story about her secret hobbies. She revealed that her ex-boyfriend was into the occult and that they performed a ritual sacrifice on a living person together. Stagg took this information rather calmly. At least he kept in touch with Lizzie, and they spent a few more hours together and parted ways. After that, they met a few more times, and finally, the police decided to move on to the final part. Walking in the park, Lizzie talked to Colin about Rachel's murder. She told him that she wished he had been the murderer because she was aroused by thoughts of the crime, but it didn't work. Stagg apologized to her and told her that he had nothing to do with the murder. Lizzie tried to get him to confess several more times, but he kept denying his involvement. It looked as if the police had botched a 6-month operation. They couldn't get any evidence that Stagg had killed Rachel, but the detectives were still convinced they were right. That's why they did arrest him in August 1993. At the interrogation, Colin was told all the cards and that all this time, he had been in correspondence with a police officer. He read excerpts from these letters describing various perversions and was also introduced to the real Lizzie herself. Stagg was shocked, but, on the advice of his lawyer, refused to answer police questions. Investigators had hoped to the last that, under such pressure, he would confess to the murder, but he did not. All they had to do now was to take the case to trial. All this dragged down for a year, which Stagg spent in custody. When the case finally went to trial, his lawyers blew the prosecution's arguments to smithereens. Even the judge was forced to admit that the whole operation with Lizzie James was overkill and that the police had behaved in an extremely unprofessional manner. In September 1994, Colin was acquitted of all charges and released. Lizzie James later resigned from the police, citing serious psychological trauma from the operation. The police, who had spent more than £3 million on this investigation, were deadlocked. They had not a single the suspect, and most of the detectives continued to think the Stagg was the murderer. And they were not alone in this opinion. The newspapers and the public continued to blame him for what happened. Every time he went out on the street, he caught the embittered looks of passersby. Almost the entire country believed that the murderer had gotten away with it, and this only added to the hatred towards Stagg. This went on for years. The Rachel Nichol case was finally hung in the balance, and the police made little effort to look for new suspects. Why, when they were all sure of Colin's involvement by then, Rachel's husband, along with Alex, had gone to live in Europe for several reasons. First, he was constantly harassed by journalists, which reminded his son of his mother's murder. Secondly, the father felt it was not safe for his son to remain in London. He was the only person who had seen the murderer for a long time. No one knew which country they had moved to. Later, journalists did get wind that they lived in Spain and France. In 2000, Scotland Yard took up the case and assigned a new team to it. They studied all the collected material and witness statements, but they failed to find a new suspect. Only 3 years later, they announced that they had found DNA from an unknown man, and Rachel's clothes analysis technology had only just matured to such a capability. And in 1992, such a discovery was simply impossible to even in 2003. This tiny sample, which took experts 18 months to find, was not enough to establish identity. The data from that sample was only enough to rule out unsuitable people, and a year later, in 2004, the police finally had a new suspect. His DNA was already in the database, and a comparison with a sample from Rachel's clothes showed mixed results. That man was the 38-year-old Robert Napper, a convicted murderer and serial rapist who, at the time, had already spent 10 years in a halfway house. His biography is striking in two ways: the cruelty of his crimes and the ease with which he evaded justice later. Because of this, the police would face a wave of outrage from the public. Napper first came into the hands of law enforcement in 1986. He was then given a suspended sentence for assault with an airgun. In 1989, he broke into a young mother's house and abused her. For the next 4 years, there was a series of similar attacks, but the police did not tie them together and could not reach the suspect. What followed was something truly amazing. Napper confessed to his mother that he had carried out all these attacks. She called the police and told them everything, and what do you think? They found no connection between the crimes and the woman's story, so they didn't look into the Napper's involvement. The only thing the mother could do was convince her son to see a psychiatrist. When Napper came back from there, he said that the specialist thought he was crazy but took no further action. A short time later, he assaulted and abused a woman and her child in Crystal Palace Park. This happened just weeks before Rachel's murder. But again, the police failed to see the connection. This was by no means the only such attack in Crystal Palace Park, and police at some point figured out that one man was committing the crimes from the words of witnesses. They compiled a sketch of him. After the publication in the newspapers, several of Napper's neighbors contacted the detectives. They all pointed to the man, and the police called Napper for a blood sample. He simply ignored the request, and the detectives did not go looking for him. They simply forgot about him. In November 1993, London was rocked by another high-profile crime which, as it later turned out, was also committed by Napper, a young mother, Samantha Bassett, who was attacked in her room. In addition, the perpetrator did not spare her young daughter. What he did to them shocked even experienced detectives. The police photographer who arrived on the scene could not return to work for several months because of the shock of what he saw. Remarkably, the same profiler who had been brought in to investigate Rachel's murder worked on all of these cases, and he believed that all of these attacks had nothing to do with each other. The detectives also saw no possible connection to Rachel's case because they were 100% sure that Colin Stay was guilty. The team of investigators handling the attack at Crystal Palace Park also saw no connection. Napper was nearly 190 centimeters tall, and based on witness testimony, the perpetrator was shorter. But the maniac made one mistake in the attack on Samantha Bassett. He left a fingerprint in her apartment that allowed his identity to be run through the database. Napper had previously been fingerprinted after he stalked a woman in the street. He was not arrested until May 1994. When questioned, he denied guilt and was extremely calm in his apartment. They found maps of London on which the locations of the attacks and murders were circled, including the place where Rachel was murdered. They also found several notes on how to properly abuse women. Shortly before that, police found a knife in the very park where Rachel has murdered. The fingerprints on the handle matched Napper's, but even that wasn't enough to make detectives consider him the killer because they were still convinced Colin Stay was guilty. Napper, however, was still considered a suspect in Rachel's murder for a while, but those charges were quickly dropped. The thing is that Napper said he was at work that day in 1995. Napper went on trial for the murder of Samantha and her daughter. The prosecution struck a deal with him in which he pleaded guilty to manslaughter, and the court sent him to a closed psychiatric hospital instead of the prison. The fact was that Napper had been diagnosed with a number of disorders, including Asperger's syndrome and schizophrenia. Because of this, the maniac could have avoided prison anyway, with or without a confession. As a result, the judge sent him to provide a psychiatric hospital for treatment with no time limit. Later, detectives wanted to question him about Rachel's murder, but the doctors forbade it because they feared it might aggravate the napper's mental status. Back to 2004. The new team of detectives on the Rachel Nichol case finally began to take a closer look at Napper as a suspect after they compared his DNA to a small sample found on the young woman's body. The results were very mixed. That sample wasn't enough to confirm the similarity. It was only enough to rule out other suspects in Napper's case. The results did not do with 100% certainty. Investigators kept digging further. Using new technology on Rachel's clothing, they managed to spot a microscopic piece of paint. Experts examined it and concluded that it matched the paint on the napper's iron toolbox. Prior to his arrest, he worked as a storekeeper for the Department of Defense. It is not entirely clear how we could have gotten a job there with his set of mental disorders, but the fact remains he combined assault and murder with his day job. It took Scotland Yard 3 years to prepare this case for trial, and in 2007, Napper was charged with the murder of Rachel Nichol. During the first hearing, he pleaded not guilty, which prolonged the trial for almost a year. At the end, Napper agreed the same deal he had been offered 12 years earlier, a change of plea to manslaughter in exchange for a confession on December 18, 2008. 16 years after the murder, he finally confessed. For Napper himself, the verdict did not change anything. He was left in the same hospital, under heavy guard. Most likely he will never be released. But the news made a lot of noise all over Britain. The police suffered it the most, fixating on Colin Stagg and completely ignoring Colin Stagg and other serious leads. Instead, the investigation was divided into 3 separate lines. Each team of detectives looked for different criminals, while behind all the attacks and murders was Napper. That the same year, 2008, Stagg sued the police department for £706,000, a record for Britain for unwarranted criminal prosecutions. The Metropolitan Police also issued a public apology to him. He subsequently wrote several books about his life experiences. In them, he described what it was like to be accused of murder. Stagg admitted that for 10 years, his life was effectively ruined by journalists and the police. After the whole of Britain finally believed in his innocence, he decided to spend all the compensation on travel, expensive cars, and other things that brought him joy. In 2010, a special commission issued a report criticizing the actions of homicide detectives. This document was called a catalogue of wrong decisions and mistakes, and the reason for this is not only the fact that the murder could not be solved for 16 years. The whole point is that if the police had done their job properly, they could have arrested Napper before he killed Rachel, Samantha, and her daughter. No disciplinary action followed. However, all of the detectives involved in the case retired, and one of the lead investigators passed away. As for Rachel's son, Alex, he did not give his first interview until 2017, 25 years after the incident. He said that growing up without his mother had been problematic, but that he had found the strength to let go and move on. Shortly before the interview, he went to the very place where his mother was murdered, and at the moment, he was able to finally let go of the heavy weight of the past. One can only hope that this story, like others like it, will serve as a lesson for law enforcement agencies around the world. It is too late to speculate about whether or not the police could have saved Rachel and Samantha, but it is never too late to draw conclusions and prevent future crimes. Please share your thoughts on this story in the comments, and don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed it. Thank you for watching.
In a small town, a horrifying crime unfolds. A happy family shattered by a shocking incident. They lived an exemplary life until one fateful morning. The police received 2 distress calls, and what they encountered was straight out of a detective thriller. For 7 long years, the truth remained hidden, and the case became a mystery that captivated an entire town. Suspicion falls on the victim's husband, but he maintains his innocence. Can the truth be unraveled? Honey Debate was born on July 31, 1976, in a small American town of Ellington, Connecticut. She had 2 sisters and a brother. From an early age, Connie stood out for her kindness and desire to help people, which earned her many friends. Later on, fueled by these qualities, Connie decided to pursue a medical education. She studied at the University of Connecticut and then found employment in the sales department of a pharmaceutical company. In addition to her career, Connie became the vice president of a charitable organization in her town which provided free emergency medical assistance to people. She also desired to create a large and close-knit family. In the early 2000s, an opportunity presented itself when she met a man named Richard, and a romance blossomed between them. The couple got married on July 4, 2003, and a few years later, they had a son. 3 years after that, their second son arrived. Around the same time, Connie and Richard decided to move into a new home, purchasing a large house in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Ellington. It was an ideal choice for their expanding family, with a spacious house and a large backyard where their sons could play. Moreover, their close friends lived in the same area, and they frequently spent time together as families. For many years, they led an exemplary life. However, everything changed on December 23, 2015. That morning, the police department received 2 calls in quick succession. First, the security company alerted them that the alarm had gone off at Richard and Connie's house. 5 minutes later, Richard himself called the police, requesting assistance. The officers promptly arrived at the house only to be greeted by a horrifying sight. One of them entered through the open front door and immediately noticed a trail of blood leading from the staircase in the basement to the kitchen. Following the trail, the officer discovered Richard in the kitchen. The man was partially tied to an overturned chair with zip ties, lying face down on the floor with wounds visible on his body and another plastic restraint around his neck. The officer called out to him, and Richard replied with a single sentence, "He's still in the house." The police immediately requested backup and began searching both the building and the entire neighborhood. Soon after, they made another horrifying discovery as they descended to the basement. They found Connie's lifeless body with a gun lying next to her. Meanwhile, detectives freed Richard, and while they waited for an ambulance, he recounted what had happened that morning. At around 8:10 a.m., Richard had taken their sons to the bus stop from where they would go to school. Afterward, he returned home, changed into his office attire, got into his car, and headed to work. Meanwhile, Connie was preparing for a sports activity taking place at the local charity organization's gymnasium. Shortly after Richard left home, he received a notification from the security service about an alarm triggered at their house. This had happened before due to their cat, whom they often left home alone. Richard also realized that he had forgotten to take his laptop, which he needed for work. Therefore, he decided to turn back. Before turning around, he messaged his boss, informing them that he would be delayed, and then drove back home. Richard arrived at the house sometime between 8:45 a.m. and 9 a.m. Upon entering, he heard a noise on the second floor. As he went upstairs and entered his and Connie's bedroom, to his horror, he saw an unknown man rummaging through the closet. The intruder was dressed in camouflage clothing with his face covered. As soon as the perpetrator noticed Richard, he lunged at him, knocking him to the floor. The assailant demanded Richard's wallet, bank cards, and their PIN codes. Otherwise, he threatened to wait for his family and kill them. Almost immediately after that, Richard heard the garage door open, indicating that Connie had returned from her activity earlier than expected. He shouted that there was someone in the house and told her to run. The intruder had it downstairs, but Richard attempted to stop him. During the struggle, the unknown man managed to push Richard off the stairs, and he fell to the first floor. While he was regaining his senses, Connie ran to the basement where they kept 2 handguns, and the assailant pursued her. A few moments later, Richard managed to stand up and followed to the basement. However, by the time he reached there, the unknown man already had the gun, and in the next second, he shot Connie. The sound of the gunshot was so loud that Richard was almost deafened for a few minutes. He thought he heard a second shot shortly after, but wasn't certain. Afterward, the assailant made Richard sit on a chair and bound his hand and leg with plastic restraints. Then he put down the gun, picked up some tools lying in the basement, and inflicted several puncture wounds on Richard with them. Following that, the unknown man knocked over some items, took a blowtorch, and began burning them. Apparently, by using the blowtorch, the intruder attempted to eliminate evidence. Afterward, he turned to Richard and directed the torch toward him. Due to being only partially restrained to the chair, Richard managed to stand up and knock the torch out of the assailant's hands. He grabbed it and directed it toward the attacker, setting fire to the mask on his face. The unarmed perpetrator immediately fled the basement, and shortly after, Richard went upstairs to call the police. While Richard was recounting the incident, the police thoroughly searched the house and an area several kilometers around it. However, they failed to find the suspect. The only thing they discovered was Richard's wallet, which was lying on the lawn in front of the house. Investigators called in canine units with search dogs in an attempt to track the killer. They allowed the dogs to sniff the wallet as the perpetrator had held it for some time. However, it didn't work, and 3 different dogs kept leading the detectives back to Richard. Following that, the canines were taken through the house, hoping they would detect the scent of an intruder, but that also yielded no results. Detectives found it strange because trained dogs are usually capable of detecting human presence even days later. But in this case, none of the 3 dogs picked up anything. Another peculiar aspect was the timeline of the incident. According to Richard, approximately 5 minutes had passed between the moment he entered the house and when the assailant fled. Considering that Richard returned home between 8:40 a.m. and 9 a.m., everything should have ended no later than 9:05 a.m. However, the security company only reported the alarm activation at 10:16 a.m., and Richard himself called the police a few minutes later. It seemed that he had spent over an hour in the house before contacting the police. Additionally, there was too little time between Connie's departure for her sports activity and her return. Meanwhile, Richard was taken to the hospital where doctors determined that his injuries were not life-threatening. Their detectives interviewed him again, hoping to obtain a description of the attacker. Richard stated that the intruder was tall and well-built, but his face was impossible to see due to the mask. Forensic experts examined Connie's body and found that she had sustained 2 gunshot wounds, one in the abdomen and another in the back of the head. The detectives had very few leads, and they continued to talk to Richard, hoping to gather more details. The more questions they asked, the more suspicious his answers became. Initially, Richard claimed that he had left for work while Connie was getting ready for her training session, but in the hospital, he stated that he couldn't recall with certainty who had left first. He also couldn't remember if he had activated the alarm before leaving or if his wife had done it. Richard also changed his version of events. Initially, he claimed to have heard a noise on the 2nd floor as soon as he entered the house, but now he stated that there was no noise and he only noticed the intruder when he went upstairs and entered the bedroom. He also said that the assailant didn't push him down the stairs from the 2nd floor, but rather he tripped and fell himself. However, the main inconsistency was regarding the moment of the murder. Richard stated that he rushed into the basement and witnessed the assailant taking the gun from Connie before shooting her. However, initially, he claimed to be unaware of how the attacker acquired the weapon. Furthermore, according to Richard, the basement was pitch dark, leading the detectives to wonder how he could see what was happening. Then Richard also added that he couldn't see Connie's body due to the darkness, so he wasn't certain if his wife was dead. Another suspicious element was the superficial wounds inflicted on Richard with pliers. They posed no real threat, but the interesting part was that most of them were on the left side of his torso, considering that Richard was right-handed and his right hand was not restrained to the chair. He could have self-inflicted those wounds. Additionally, there were no bruises or contusions on his body. According to Richard, he fought with the assailant and fell down the stairs, which should have resulted in abrasions, but there were none. Richard's shorts had blood stains, but forensic analysts found inconsistencies with his story. If someone had inflicted wounds on him with a sharp object while he was sitting on the chair, at least a few drops of blood should have landed on the lower part of the shorts, but there were no traces there. The same applied to the area in the basement where the assailant struck Richard with pliers. There should have been a considerable amount of blood on the floor near the chair, but the investigators found only a few small droplets. That wasn't all. According to Richard, after the attacker fled, he regained consciousness after a while and then crawled up the stairs from the basement to the 1st floor. However, there was not a single trace of blood on the steps, even though Richard was injured and should have been bleeding. Another peculiar detail caught the attention of the detectives while examining the crime scene. They noticed that the basement window was open. The police considered the possibility that the intruder entered the house through that window, but there was an interesting point: the locks had been removed from the inside. The same was true for another window, and the investigators decided to conduct a small experiment. They attempted to open it from the outside, but they succeeded only when one of the officers struck the frame and shattered the glass. This led the detectives to doubt that the intruder could have opened the window even without the locks without breaking the glass. All these factors made the investigators question the authenticity of Richard's story. They went back to him at the hospital and asked if they had any problems in their marriage, to which he stated that he had a mistress, but Connie was aware of it. According to his account, he and his wife wanted to have a third child, but Connie was unable to conceive. That's when Richard proposed the idea of surrogacy, and he chose his former classmate as the surrogate mother. She had recently gone through a divorce and wanted to have a child. Richard and his wife presented her with a plan: she would conceive Richard's child, and then the three of them would raise the baby together, and the woman agreed. Initially, they planned to proceed with medical fertilization procedures, but it turned out to be too expensive, so they decided to do it in a more natural way, and Richard engaged in intimate relations with the woman, resulting in her pregnancy. He claimed that Connie was completely okay with the arrangement and supported everything that was happening. The detectives had serious doubts about the credibility of this story, as it sounded highly unnatural. They continued to question Richard, and his account changed once again. Just a few minutes after telling the story, he stated that, in fact, Connie and his friend never met or spoke to each other. He also admitted that he wasn't sure if his wife knew about the pregnancy. During further conversation with the police, he confessed that he had been cheating on his wife with his former classmate for several years, and Connie was unaware of it. The detectives reached out to the woman, and she stated that she entered into a romantic relationship with Richard less than a year ago. She knew he was married but believed he was in the process of getting a divorce, as he had told her so. The woman became pregnant in June, 6 months before the incident occurred. Richard insisted that he had already hired a lawyer for the divorce and planned to finalize the process before the baby's birth. However, investigators found out that he hadn't contacted any lawyer, and all of Connie's acquaintances confirmed that she never mentioned anything about a divorce. All of this was enough for the detectives to consider Richard as the main suspect. However, they couldn't find any substantial evidence against him, so the police started considering all possible scenarios. That's when they discovered something interesting. Friends and relatives of the family informed them that Connie had repeatedly complained about a contractor with whom they had issues. He had done poor quality work on their house, and the couple tried to get a refund, but the contractor turned out to be quite aggressive. Connie admitted that she was genuinely afraid of him. It was because of this issue that Richard and Connie purchased 2 guns and installed an alarm system. Investigators looked into the contractor, but he had an indisputable alibi for the time of the murder. Eventually, they returned to their prime suspect, the victim's husband. For months, the police had refrained from publicly declaring him a possible murderer. All of Connie's friends and relatives believed that an unknown robber was behind the crime and sympathized with Richard. Detectives spent a lot of time talking to Connie's closest friends. They stated that if she had discovered her husband's infidelity, especially that his mistress had become pregnant, she would have undoubtedly confided in them. Other acquaintances of the family noted that Richard had been behaving strangely after the murder. He didn't appear depressed or upset, and a few days after his wife's death, he even asked a few neighbors, "Where do you usually order food from?" Digging deeper, the police discovered that Connie and Richard were facing serious financial problems. Connie was unaware of where their money was going, while Richard secretly spent it on his mistress. They also found a note titled, "Why I Want a Divorce" on her smartphone. In the note, she listed Richard's constant lies, mistreatment of her and the children, his unauthorized use of her money, and more. Based on this, investigators concluded that Connie had been contemplating ending the marriage, but she had no idea about her husband's secret life. Further examination of the financial aspect revealed that just 5 days after the murder, Richard attempted to withdraw $500,000 from his wife's insurance account. but the request was rejected by the security service. A month later, he received a $75,000 check from his wife's employer. All of this indicated that Richard may have had selfish motives for the murder, but it didn't prove his guilt. Another curious fact was that Richard canceled the contract with the security company only 19 days after the murder. If his story about the intruder was true, it would have been the most illogical move, endangering not only himself but also his two sons. Desperate to find any evidence, the detectives obtained a search warrant for all electronic devices in the house, and finally, they stumbled upon something significant. Collecting all this information together, the police were able to reconstruct the exact timeline of events. At 8:44 a.m. in the morning, the security system recorded the garage door opening and closing. Investigators determined that Connie had left for her workout because at 8:53 a.m. she was captured on camera near the gym. At 8:50 a.m., Richard, who was still at home at that time, first deactivated the alarm system and then reactivated it. After that, he was supposed to leave the house and go to work, but at 8:59 a.m., he again disabled the alarm using his remote control. Considering that the remote control works within a few meters of the system, Richard had to return home, which aligned with his claim that he went back to retrieve his laptop. However, there is one problem. He stated that he received a notification of the alarm being triggered on his way to work. During that time frame, though, the security system did not record any breaches, indicating that he didn't receive any notifications. At 9:02 a.m., Richard accessed his email from a tablet, and 2 minutes later, he wrote to his boss that he would be delayed because his alarm had gone off. Another inconsistency emerged here. Not only were there no actual alarm notifications, but Richard also lied to the police in his email. He claimed to have sent it immediately after receiving the notification while being several kilometers away from home, but the tablet data showed that he was at home when he sent the email since it was connected to the home Wi-Fi. It appeared that he spent a minimum of 4 minutes inside the house before he supposedly encountered the intruder, and everything that happened thereafter took less than a minute, which was theoretically impossible. However, the crucial evidence came from Connie's fitness tracker. She arrived at the gym at 8:53 a.m. but left a few minutes later because the classes were canceled. At 9:08 a.m., the bracelet stopped tracking steps. Based on this, investigators concluded that Connie got into her car and drove home. The journey took 8 minutes. Here is where it gets interesting. According to Richard, the assailant attacked his wife almost immediately after she entered the house. But the bracelet data contradicted this. The data showed that the woman walked 370 meters inside her house between 9:18 a.m. and 10:17 a.m. in the morning. Data from her social media account also showed that she was online for 6 minutes during this time frame. This means that Connie entered the house at 9:18 a.m. and was alive for nearly a whole hour, completely contradicting her husband's story. The crucial factor here was that the police had not just theoretical inconsistencies, but full-fledged digital evidence to support their case. Gathering this detailed information took the police over a year, and in April 2017, they finally arrested Richard. For the vast majority of his acquaintances, this event was a real shock. They had no idea what evidence the police had managed to gather and continued to see Richard as the victim. The man was accused of murder, and initially, the bail amount set for him was $5 million. However, his lawyer argued that Richard had a clean criminal record and 2 minor sons under his care. As a result, the amount was reduced to $1 million, which he promptly paid. Richard spent a whole 5 years waiting for trial as the process kept getting postponed. The trial finally began in April 2022, and during this time, the man's lawyers managed to gather many interesting facts. The defense presented evidence that 6 DNA samples belonging to an unknown individual were found in the house. They also pointed out that there was only a minimal amount of gunpowder on Richard's hands, and if he had been the one who fired the gun, there should have been much more. The prosecution refuted these arguments, stating that the gunpowder test was conducted several hours after the man was taken to the hospital, giving Richard ample time to remove most of the traces. Regarding the DNA, there was no evidence to prove that it belonged specifically to the mysterious intruder. Anyone who had visited Richard and Connie's house at least once could have left those samples. In turn, the prosecution presented a detailed digital timeline of the couple's movements that morning, contradicting all of Richard's statements. The evidence indicated that the woman died an hour after she was allegedly shot by an unknown intruder as she continued moving around the house and using social media without any indication of distress. Richard's own story became a significant argument for the prosecution as he repeatedly changed his statements. All the contradictions in his words were used as further evidence of his deceitful storytelling. The trial lasted for 22 days, and on May 10, 2022, the jury found him guilty. Richard was sentenced to 65 years in prison, but he continued to insist on his innocence. This trial was a difficult ordeal for Connie's relatives and loved ones as they only learned about all the evidence against her husband during the process. Until that point, many of them still believed in the story of the unknown robber. But once all the cards were laid out on the table, no one doubted Richard's guilt anymore. However, his lawyers announced plans to appeal the verdict until it was reviewed, but so far, these attempts have not yielded the desired result. As for Connie's sons, they remained in the custody of her relatives. At the time of the murder, they were 6 and 9 years old, but the children lived with their father until the verdict was reached. Please share your thoughts on this story in the comments and don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed it. Thank you for watching.